The first thing Commander Rowan Kepler heard after the warp went wrong was the ship trying to remember how to breathe, and he would have sworn later, when later came, if it did, that the sound had intent in it, like a wounded animal making itself small in the brush to keep from being found. The TCS Vaelbright had always been a living thing in the minds of those who served her, an old superstition, half joke and half prayer, offered under breath before hard maneuvers and hot engagements. But now the metaphor became inconveniently literal. The ventilation cycled in ragged gulps through half-sealed lungs of ductwork, and the airflow arrived uneven, tasting of cold metal and scorched insulation. Somewhere deep in the belly, a pump knocked in a slow, stubborn rhythm, like a heart that had been bruised but refused the mercy of stopping. The lights had failed into an emergency palette, amber slashes and low red halos, that made the bridge look like a chapel aisle at the edge of some unearned dawn, the kind of dawn that comes after a fire when the smoke still stings your eyes and you cannot be certain what has survived the night. He lay in his crash couch long after the straps unlocked, because he did not trust his own body to be the measure of truth. In the fleet, you learned quickly that your senses were honest only about their own panic. His mouth tasted of copper and burnt ice. His ears rang with a high, thin note that felt like the universe laughing quietly at him. When he finally sat up, the movement peeled pain along his ribs in a bright ribbon, and the pressure of it made him think of hands, unseen hands, closing around the ship. His right hand found the armrest, and the material under his palm was slick with a thin sheen of frost, warp chill that clung like a sickness. He blinked against the glare of the emergency panels and saw that the main display wall, which should have been showing the fleet's corridor map and the tactical overlay of pursuit, was instead a snow of error codes and warped starfield fragments, as though someone had shattered a window and then tried to paste the pieces back together without caring which sky belonged to which shard. Bridge, he said, not because he believed anyone would answer, but because saying the word made it seem like there might still be a bridge to stand on. The internal comm was patched into his couch controls. He keyed it with a thumb that felt numb and foreign. "This is Kepler. Status check. Any hands, sound off." Only static replied, harsh and dry. And beneath it, beneath the usual hiss and chatter of broken circuitry, there was something else, a whisper that was not electrical at all, something that suggested language without letting itself be understood. It was not a voice. It was the shape of one, an outline in fog. The sound slid into his ears and made the hair on his arms rise with a reflex he had not felt since boyhood, when he'd listened to old storms press themselves against the farmhouse windows and imagined creatures moving in the dark between lightning flashes. He unlatched the couch and stood, leaning a moment as the deck shifted under him with a tired groan. The ship's artificial gravity was trying, failing, trying again, like a child learning to balance on unsteady feet. When it caught, it did so with an ugly jerk that sent a hard spike of pain through his ribs and made him bite back a curse. He steadied himself against the side rail, drew a slow breath that tasted of ozone, and took in the bridge as if he were walking into it for the first time. It was a museum of sudden absence. The captain's chair sat canted, one armrest snapped clean, as if someone had tried to wrench it free with a panic-strength grip. The navigator's pit was empty, the helmsman's station dark except for a few blinking status lights that flashed like tired eyes. The tactical officer's console had a spiderweb crack across its display, and a thin ribbon of frost clung to the edges of the glass. A coffee mug, fleet issue, scarred and battered, floated slowly in a weak gravity bubble near the ceiling, spinning end over end with the lazy grace of something that did not know it had been abandoned. There were no bodies. That more than the damage made Rowan's throat tighten. In battle, you expected loss to leave something behind: shapes, names, tags, folded flags. In a hull breach, you expected the brutality of vacuum, the ugly truth of it. But here there was simply nothing, as if the ship had swallowed her own crew and was trying not to cry. Seats were empty. Harnesses hung open. A set of gloves lay on the deck beside the comm station, palms up like a man's hands raised in surrender. He moved to the captain's chair and stopped short of touching it. Captain Juno Merrick had sat there with an unhurried authority, a woman who could make a whole bridge crew feel as though chaos was merely weather, manageable if you knew your instruments and kept your voice steady. Rowan had been her executive officer on paper and her lieutenant in practice, the one who carried her intent into sharp orders and made it happen in the minutes between decision and consequence. He could still hear her voice in his head, clipped and calm, Kepler, take the port. Kepler, hold the line. Kepler, don't get noble on me. He saw the snapped armrest and felt a strange grief, sharp as the cold. Whatever had happened here, the captain had fought it. He forced himself back into motion, because motion was the only thing that kept panic from finding purchase. He ran his eyes over the emergency readouts. Power output was low but present. Life support was compromised but cycling. The warp coil status was wrong. The indicators were lit in patterns that did not correspond to any diagnostic chart he had ever memorized. The stabilizers registered half-burnt. The nav core was locked in a loop, trying to reconcile star data that did not match anything in the archive. The ship's clock showed 3 different timestamps at once, each one insisting it was correct. He keyed com again, cycling bands, channels, redundancy layers. This is Kepler. All hands, respond. Silence, then the faintest echo as if his own voice returned from a long hallway and had lost most of itself along the way. The whisper rode that echo, trailing behind it like a shadow. He knew what the anomaly had looked like on the long-range scopes before it took them. A dark lacework in the warp stream, a bloom of impossible geometry, like a bruise on the skin of reality. It had appeared without warning, not as a simple distortion, not as the usual turbulence that engineers grumbled about and patched through, but as something with structure, angles that bent the mind. The fleet had been running a hard translation, trying to outrun a coalition spearhead that had slipped their flank and was burning in pursuit with cruel efficiency. Coalition ships did not chase the way Terran ships did, with wild bursts of aggression and the reckless courage of a species that had learned war by losing and then learning again. Coalition ships chased like machines. They held formation. They did not waste energy. They were patient, and their patience was a weapon. The Vael proud capital ship, thick with guns and faith, had been forced wide when the port stabilizer began to fail. The warning had been small at first, a flutter in the readouts, a minor vibration that the engineering deck reported with the casual contempt of people who lived among constant alarms. Then a smaller escort frigate, the Dawn Arrow, had crossed their path in an attempt to avoid a warp eddy, and the captain had ordered the Vael to swing wider still, to avoid collision at translation speeds that would have turned both ships into a fine spray of atoms. Rowan remembered the captain's hand raised in command. He remembered the hum of the warp coils rising like a choir. He remembered the sense of pressure behind his eyes as the warp field tightened. He remembered a lightless opening where there should have been flow. And then the universe had taken them by the throat and dragged. The memory came in fragments, the bridge alarms blossoming red, the deck tilting, the taste of ice in the air as frost exploded across surfaces, the gravity stuttering so that men and women flew from their stations like toys. He remembered someone, maybe Merrick, maybe the helmsman, shouting a single word that did not make sense until after. Wound. He remembered the starfield twisting on the display, not stretching into warp lines the way it should, but folding, buckling, as if space itself were crumpling paper. He remembered a shape in the warp stream that did not belong there, a negative space that made his mind skid away from it like a hand pulled back from a hot stove. Then nothing. Now there was only the ship's ragged breathing and the great emptiness where his people should have been. He left the bridge because staying in it felt like waiting for an answer that might never come. He moved into the central spine, past bulkheads that bore hairline fractures like old scars. His boots tapped on metal that sounded too hollow. The corridor lights were low, and the air was colder here, the kind of cold that found the cracks in your bones and made them ache. He passed the mess deck and stopped in the doorway, because the sight of it hit him harder than any battlefield. Tables were bolted down as always, the long lines of them built for a crew that ate in shifts and joked about ration packs and the cook's attempts at variety. On one corner table, a tray sat half full. A bowl of stew congealed into a dark, gelatinous mass, a slice of bread torn in half, a spoon resting as if someone had set it down mid-bite. A smear of sauce marked the table edge like a thumbprint. A chair was slightly askew, the way a person left it when they planned to return in a moment. There were no bodies slumped in the seats, no blood, no signs of a struggle, only the interrupted ordinary, preserved like an insect in amber. He stepped in and the deck's gravity faltered, his stomach lurched, and the spoon lifted, drifting slowly off the tray. It spun lazily in the air, catching the amber emergency light in brief glints. Rowan reached out and caught it, and the metal was so cold it stung his skin. He set it back down as carefully as if it were a relic. He walked deeper, the soles of his boots making small sounds in the silence. A bundle of playing cards floated near the far wall, a handful of them loose and fanning out like a slow flower. Someone had been in the middle of a game. Someone had laughed. The ship remembered that laughter only as absence now. He left the mess and continued down the spine, checking compartments with the methodical focus that kept his mind from slipping into the wrong questions. He tried crew berths first, because that was where you found people hiding when disaster struck, curled in their bunks, clinging to the illusion of safety. The doors were open. Bedding was disturbed. A book lay face down on a bunk, pages fluttering faintly in the intermittent airflow. A pair of boots stood neatly by a locker, as if their owner had stepped out barefoot and intended to come back. The lockers themselves were open in places, personal items scattered. A photograph, a small carved figure, a letter folded and unfolded so many times the paper had become soft. In one corridor, a photograph drifted in slow, lazy spins in the thin air. Rowan caught it between two fingers and looked down. It showed a young woman in fleet uniform standing beside an older man and a child with a gap-toothed grin. Behind them was a farm, real soil, not hydroponics, green and sunlit. The woman's smile was tired but proud. On the back of the photo, someone had written in block letters, "For when it gets dark out there." Rowan swallowed. He tucked the photograph into his pocket, not because it belonged to him, but because leaving it drifting felt like betrayal. He moved on, checking medbay next. Medbay was intact, too intact. There were no bodies on the beds, no blood on the floor, no signs of triage. The autodock stations were idle, their screens dark. The medicine cabinets were sealed. The trauma kits were untouched. Even the emergency gurneys were still strapped into their wall mounts. The ship had not been full of wounded. It had been full of people, and then it had not. He checked the medbay logs. The last entry was from before translation, a routine status check. No casualty reports afterward. No emergency alerts. It was as if the moment after the anomaly did not exist in the ship's memory except as damage. He walked to the cryo bay because sometimes the fleet kept contingency pods for key crew during extended warp operations. Cryo was empty. The pods were sealed, frosted, inert. No one had thought to flee into them. No one had had time. He returned to the central spine with a growing cold in his chest that had nothing to do with the failing life support. The ship's emptiness was not the aftermath of a fight. It was the aftermath of a theft. In the fleet, you learned to name threats. Naming gave shape, and shape gave the illusion of control. Hull breach, fire, borders, radiation leak. Each term had a protocol. Each protocol had steps. Each step gave you something to do with your hands. What name did you give to a ship that had swallowed its own crew? Rowan found himself speaking aloud, softly, as if to anchor himself. "You can't just disappear," he murmured, though he did not know who he was addressing, the ship, the void, the universe itself. The whisper in the calm static seemed to press closer, as if listening. He made himself return to routine because routine was a raft. He went back to the bridge, not to sit in the captain's chair, but to access the ship's systems properly. He pulled up the survival protocol interface and began to log notes with the careful thoroughness of a man preparing for a long siege. He recorded the status of life support, the remaining oxygen reserves, the ration stores, the water recyclers. He noted power output fluctuations. He wrote down the condition of thrusters and stabilizers. He keyed an emergency beacon diagnostic and then stopped his hand before activating it. Broadcasting was death in hostile territory, and the fleet had been in flight from a spearhead of enemies that did not forgive. He wrote a log entry anyway, because he needed the act of speaking to the future, even if the future was only his own mind in a week when loneliness became hunger. His voice sounded strange in the empty bridge. "Ship log, Commander Rowan Kepler. We have suffered warp anomaly during translation. Bridge personnel missing. Crew missing. No casualties present. Ship systems damaged. I am alive. I will attempt to locate survivors." The words were too small for the situation. He hated them for that. But he said them anyway, and the recording light blinked, indifferent. When he was done, he left again, this time heading toward the engineering decks, because if there were survivors, there was a good chance they would gather where the ship's heart beat. The accessways down the spine were steep, the ladders cold under his hands. He moved carefully, because gravity was still unreliable, and a fall in an empty ship could kill you as surely as an enemy bullet. As he descended, he began to sense subtle wrongness in the ship's structure. Bulkheads seemed to curve in ways they should not, just barely, as if the metal remembered having been shaped differently and was trying to return to that memory. In one junction, A corridor that should have run straight seemed to bend slightly to the left, though his map insisted it did not. He walked it anyway and found himself back at the same junction as if the ship had folded a small loop into itself. His breath caught. He checked the deck markings. They were correct. He was not lost. The ship was altered. He heard faint echoes in the intercom, not words, but tones like distant singing muffled by walls. Once, he heard a laugh, brief and bright, and spun around with his heart hammering, only to find an empty corridor and the emergency lights blinking patiently. His mind tried to tell him it was stress, a hallucination born of shock and grief. But the ship's systems were doing things that did not belong to hallucinations. The whisper in the comm static persisted, patient as tide. On Deck 6, in the engineering accessway, he found the first sign of another living human, a smear of oil across a maintenance panel, fresh enough to shine in the emergency light. He followed it like a hunter reading a trail in snow. The accessway was narrow, lined with conduits and coolant pipes, the air warmer here, thick with the smell of sweat, metal, and that faint bite of ozone that meant power was moving where it shouldn't. The oil smear became a trail of fingerprints on handholds, a scuff mark on the deck, a discarded strip of insulation. At the primary junction, an access hatch had been forced. The bolts were bent outward, and a length of cable had been looped through the handhold in the crude way of someone who didn't have the time or the tools to do it cleanly. Beyond the hatch, the hum of machinery was stronger, a low vibration that Rowan felt in his teeth. He stepped through slowly, hand near his sidearm, because in the fleet you learn to be cautious even of your own shadow. "Rowan," a voice said, hoarse and delighted in the same breath. "About damn time." Chief Mechanist Sable Ilyan emerged from behind a bank of coolant manifolds with a wrench in hand, face smeared with grease in dark arcs that made her look like she'd been painted by war. Her hair was tied back with a strip of fabric torn from something that might once have been a uniform. Her left sleeve was ripped nearly to the shoulder, and a rough bandage showed beneath, already darkening with blood. She looked smaller than she had on duty, stripped of the swagger that came from being the person who kept a capital ship alive. But her eyes were the same, bright, sharp, furious at anything that dared to break. They stared at each other for a heartbeat too long, the way survivors do when they find another heartbeat in the ruins and have to convince themselves it isn't a hallucination. Rowan felt relief hit him like gravity returning, too sudden, too heavy. His throat tightened, and for a moment he could not speak. "You're alive," he managed. Sable snorted, and the sound was half laugh, half sob strangled down. "Temporarily." He stepped forward and touched her shoulder because physical contact made the reality of her presence solid. Her uniform was stiff with dried coolant in places, and her skin under the grime felt hot. She flinched, then let him. "How many?" he asked, though he already knew the answer in his bones. Her eyes flicked away, and the movement was too deliberate. "You and me, that's what I've got. I've run the corridors twice. I've yelled until I couldn't. I've checked medbay and cryo. Nothing. No bodies. No," she swallowed. "No sign of them at all." The words landed like stones. Rowan felt something in him tighten, not into despair, but into a hard knot of determination, because despair was a luxury for people who could afford to stop moving. He looked past her into the open guts of the ship. The warp core chamber was sealed behind thick blast doors, but the indicator lights on the coil housings were wrong, a pattern that looked like a foreign alphabet. The main engineering consoles were lit in odd sequences, and a bank of diagnostic screens showed overlapping readings as if multiple realities were trying to claim the same data. "Status?" Rowan asked, because that was the question you asked when you did not know what else to say. "Warp coils are alive," Sable said, and her voice held both awe and anger, "but they're not right. They're singing, I know how that sounds. They're resonating in harmonics I can't map. The stabilizers are half burnt, the nav is full of ghosts, and our power grid is doing this thing where it thinks it's in 3 places at once." Rowan tried to smile. It came out as a grimace. "So we're in excellent shape." Sable's gaze sharpened. "Where are we?" He hesitated. The admission had weight. Commanders weren't supposed to say, "I don't know." They were supposed to point at a map and claim certainty, even if the map was made of prayers. But the main display had been a shattered window, and the starfield fragments had been wrong, constellations in unfamiliar positions, spectral lines that didn't match recorded catalogs. He could not lie to her. Lies were another luxury. "I don't know," Rowan said. Sable nodded slowly, as if she'd expected that. Her jaw tightened. "Then we do the only thing we can do. We find a reference. We get the ship moving, quiet and slow, and we hunt our way back." Back. The word carried the whole fleet inside it. the ships that still carried their people, the voices that still filled comm channels, the warm, stubborn idea that humanity did not drift alone if it could help it. Rowan felt that word in his chest like a lodestone. He looked around engineering with a new clarity. This was sanctuary, yes, but it was also the ship's heart, and hearts were meant to push blood through broken bodies. Inventory, he said. Sable's expression flickered into something like satisfaction, because giving her a job was giving her a way not to fall apart. She began to rattle off numbers and conditions with the practiced speed of someone who had lived her life in the language of systems. Auxiliary reactor is functioning, but unstable. It shudders under load like an old horse. Main reactor is no, not safe to touch yet. Thrusters, 2 functioning, third can be coaxed into bursts if I reroute coolant and prey. Point defense grid is partially alive. Main guns are offline, don't even look at them. Life support is cycling on backups, we're losing efficiency but not air yet. Hull integrity is compromised on several decks but seals held. Gravity is you felt it. Rowan nodded, listening, absorbing. He could see her mind working, building a picture. Sable loved the ship the way some people loved land, fiercely, practically, without romance but with deep reverence for what kept you alive. In the fleet, engineers were the ones who spoke to steel as if it could hear. They called it talking when they coaxed a stubborn valve into working. They called it listening when they put a palm to a bulkhead and felt for vibrations. They knew that crafted things carried something of their makers, and if you were patient, you could almost feel the intention in the welds. I've been talking to her, Sable said, as if reading his thoughts. She lifted her wrench and tapped it gently against a coolant pipe, and the sound rang like a bell. She's hurt, she's confused, but she's still here. Rowan looked at the coil housings again, at the strange alphabet of lights. He thought of the bridge, of the snapped armrest on the captain's chair. He thought of the crew's absence, swallowed without ceremony. I heard a whisper, he admitted. In calm static. Sable's face tightened. I've heard things. I've chalked it up to electrical bleed, or my own head trying to make sense of the nonsense. Rowan wanted to agree, he wanted to say it was stress, but the ship's systems were disagreeing with reality. Keep it in mind, he said. He was about to speak again when his comm unit crackled, sharp enough to make both of them tense. A voice came through, not human. It was precise and clipped, with a rhythm that suggested consonants meant to cut. Terran unit, I am present. I require, Rowan's hand went to the sidearm at his hip. Sable's wrench rose like a club. They followed the sound down a side passage adjacent to engineering. The brig annex, a small holding space used during joint operations when prisoners were taken and processed. The door was buckled inward. The emergency release had been torn open, and the locking mechanism hung in pieces like broken teeth. The air inside was colder, still, as if the compartment had been sealed long enough for warp chill to settle deep. Inside, seated against the far wall, was the alien. He was tall even sitting, longer-limbed than human, with a frame built for endurance rather than brute force. His skin was a muted slate tone, and faint bioluminescent lines traced along his neck and forearms, markings that pulsed dimly with each breath, like embers under ash. His eyes were black and glossy, too reflective, set in a face that was both elegant and severe. He wore a torn restraint harness, broken at one shoulder, and around his wrists were the remnants of magnet cuffs, twisted and bent where he had forced them. Rowan had seen his kind before, in battle footage and diplomatic dossiers. Keth, from the coalition that had declared humanity a contagion and a threat to order. The coalition was not one species, but a pact of many, held together by doctrine and fear, and the Keth were among its sharpest knives, diplomats when it served, assassins when it didn't. This one had been captured during a skirmish weeks ago, and Captain Merrick had kept him alive for intel and leverage. Rowan remembered the debates on the bridge, some officers wanting him spaced, others wanting him interrogated until he broke. Merrick had looked at Rowan and said, "We do not become what they say we are, Kepler. We hold a line even when no one is watching." Now the prisoner looked at Rowan and Sable with an expression that managed to be both disdainful and exhausted. "You are armed," the Keth said. His Terran standard was accented but fluent, each syllable precise. "Lower your weapons. I have no interest in dying on a derelict." Sable gave a low laugh that held no humor. "Bold of you to assume we're the ones dying." Rowan kept his sidearm half-raised, finger off the trigger. The alien's posture was relaxed, but Rowan had seen that kind of relaxation before in predators, in seasoned soldiers, in people who had learned how to look harmless while calculating angles. "Name," Rowan said. The alien's throat lines flickered. a subtle pulse that might have been a sigh. Vael. Rowan tasted old briefings. Vael, of the Ketha line, interrogation-resistant, linguistically trained. He wondered how many people had died to bring this prisoner aboard, and how many had vanished now without leaving even the courtesy of a corpse. "Why are you loose?" Rowan asked. "The ship screamed," Vael said, as if that explained everything. His gaze drifted to the twisted hatch behind Rowan. "Locks failed, gravity failed, your crew ceased." He pronounced the word with clinical distance. "I walked, I found no one, then I found the ship's heat and your crude attempts to mend it." Sable's jaw tightened. Crude. Vael's eyes narrowed, and for the first time Rowan saw something like interest in them. "Effective," Vael said. "Primitive things are often effective." Rowan didn't like him. That was too simple a phrase for what he felt, which was layered anger at wars and borders and the way the galaxy had decided humanity should be punished for existing loudly. But dislike was useful. It kept the blood moving. "Here's how this goes," Rowan said. "You're alive because we need every hand, and because I'm not killing a prisoner on principle. You cooperate, you live, you cause problems, and I'll use you as ballast." Vael's throat lines brightened a fraction in what might have been amusement. "You intend to fly this ship with 2 Terrans and an enemy?" "We intend," Sable said, stepping closer, wrench still in hand, "to get home. Whether you're along for it depends on how much you like breathing." Vael looked at them both, and in the emergency light his eyes seemed to drink their shapes, reflecting them back with cold clarity. "Home," he repeated softly, as if tasting the word. "Very well, I will observe your attempt." "Good," Rowan said. "Then stand up." Vael rose with a grace that had no need to announce itself. When he moved, the lines along his forearms pulsed faintly. Rowan felt, irrationally, that the alien was listening to something they could not hear, like a man putting his ear to a wall to catch the sound of approaching footsteps. They returned to engineering, because work was the only acceptable response to grief that had no body. Sable took inventory like a woman determined to bully the universe into compliance. She climbed ladders, crawled through vents, and spoke to the ship in a low voice when she thought Rowan wasn't listening. Rowan reclaimed the bridge, forcing the ship's systems through reset cycles and bringing up nav in strip-down mode. Vael prowled the edges, silent at first, then offering commentary in the manner of someone who did not think words were a gift. "You are far," Vael said at last, watching the sensor readouts as Rowan wrestled with them. "Define far," Rowan muttered. He had one hand on the console and the other braced against the captain's chair, because the deck was still subtly shifting as if the ship could not decide which way was down. Vael touched the air with 2 fingers, a gesture that suggested both calculation and ritual. "Beyond the Keth patrol lines, beyond your fleet's last known translation corridor, there is a fold here, a wound. You have been thrown into an old place." Sable, who had come up to the bridge to report on thruster status, shot him a look. "Old place," Vael's throat lines dimmed. "There are places where warp traffic has been forbidden for centuries, places that do not forget what passes through them." Rowan leaned back in the captain's chair, empty now, a throne without a king. He stared at the fractured starfield on the display wall and felt the edges of his mind trying to slide away from the implication of Vael's words. "Is that superstition or science?" he asked. Vael's gaze met his. "Is there a difference, Commander Kepler, when the result is the same?" Rowan did not answer because the bridge screens had finally resolved a partial reading. A cluster of stars with spectral signatures that matched something in the archives but shifted as if observed through water. A label crawled across the interface in broken code, then stabilized. Halo Verge outer lattice. Sable whistled softly, and the sound was both awe and dread. "We're not supposed to be here." "No," Rowan said, feeling the universe settle its cold hand on his shoulder. "We're not." The Halo Verge was a region of warped physics and old stories, a borderland where the first human exploration ships had lost crews and gained legends. It was not near any major trade route. It was not near any friendly port. It was, in fleet doctrine, a hazard zone marked with cautious language, unreliable warp transit, anomalous sensor returns, unexplained losses. In the mess decks, recruits had whispered about lights that followed hulls, about voices in comm channels that spoke in dead relatives' tones, about ships that returned with their clocks wrong and their metal slightly changed. Officers had laughed at those whispers and told them to focus on drills. Engineers had not laughed as much. Rowan had never believed much in ghost stories. He believed in steel and training and the simple arithmetic of survival. But the Vaelbright had swallowed her crew, and belief had little to do with that. He looked at the empty bridge again and felt something like a vow harden in his chest. It was not the bright vow of heroics, not the kind that came with speeches and banners. It was a grim vow, the kind made by farmers watching a storm flatten their fields and deciding they would plant again anyway. "We go back," he said. Sable nodded. "We go back." Vael tilted his head, studying them as if they were a new species. "And you believe you can slip through hostile space in a crippled capital ship with 2 Terrans and 1 prisoner." Rowan's smile this time held teeth. "We don't need to slip through all of it. We need to find a corridor. We need a signal. We need one clean sprint at the end." Sable pointed at the nav display, tapping the nearest region with stable readings. "There's an old trade route here, abandoned by humans after the Verge incidents, but Keth might still use the edges. If we ride the dead lanes and stay cold, we can get within broadcast range of the fleet's relay buoys." Vail's throat lines flickered. "Dead lanes are dead for reasons." "Everything's dead for reasons," Sable said. "We're not arguing with reasons, we're arguing with time." Rowan set the ship into minimal thrust, and the Vailbright began to move like a wounded giant learning to walk again. The thrusters responded sluggishly, a heavy push that sent a faint tremor through the hull. The starfield on the display shifted with slow reluctance. Outside the viewports, the Halo Verge's particulate haze drifted like ash in water, faintly luminous in places where unknown radiation excited it. It looked like the remains of something ancient, a battlefield between stars, though sensors could not identify the composition cleanly. The first day, if day meant anything here, where clocks argued with themselves and light was filtered through dust, was spent in a kind of grim silence punctuated by the clank of tools and the occasional curse. Sable lived in the engineering decks, climbing ladders, crawling through vents, talking to the ship like an old friend that had disappointed her but was still family. Rowan rationed power, reconfigured sensor sweeps, and wrote log entries no one might ever read, because he needed the act of speaking to the future. He mapped the ship's remaining functional compartments and sealed off damaged ones. He set ration protocols, counting calories and liters the way a man counts seeds when he knows winter will be long. He forced himself to eat even when his stomach churned, because hunger was another enemy, and enemies were not allowed to win by waiting. Vael stayed near the bridge, sometimes watching, sometimes withdrawing into stillness that looked like meditation. He rarely slept. When he did, it was in brief intervals, seated upright with his eyes half closed, as if sleep was a concession rather than a need. He observed the humans with quiet intensity. He asked few questions, but when he did, they cut close. "Why do you log?" he asked once, as Rowan recorded another status update. Rowan kept his eyes on the console. "Because if we don't make sense of this, it will make sense of us." Vail's throat lines pulsed faintly. "You think words can bind chaos," Rowan shrugged. "Sometimes they can." Vael did not argue, he simply watched. On the second drift, Rowan found Vael with his palm pressed to a bulkhead, eyes closed, throat lines pulsing faintly. The sight made Rowan's spine tighten with instinctive unease. He approached quietly. "What are you doing?" he asked. Vael opened his eyes slowly. "Listening." "To what?" "The ship," Vael said simply. "It has been touched." Rowan's jaw tightened. "By the anomaly?" Vail's gaze drifted toward the dark of space beyond the armored viewports. "By the Verge, by something that lives in the folds you call warp. Your people treat it like a river, we treat it like a sea. But here," his throat lines dimmed as if a shadow passed through him, "here it is neither." Rowan wanted to dismiss it. He wanted to reduce it to electromagnetic interference and stress hallucinations and the mind's desperate need to pattern chaos into story. But the crew's absence sat in the ship like a missing limb, undeniable. And the whisper beneath calm static persisted, patient and intimate. When Sable came up to the bridge with a new report, Rowan asked her quietly if she had heard anything strange beyond the usual mechanical groans. She hesitated, then nodded once. "Sometimes," she said. Like someone's in the next room talking, but when I go, there's no one. And sometimes I swear the ship shifts in ways it shouldn't. Bulkheads settle, pipes adjust. I know that sounds like I've been sniffing coolant." Rowan looked at Vael, who met his gaze with calm certainty. "It's not just in our heads," Rowan said. Sable's mouth tightened. "I didn't say it was." They continued anyway, because there was no other choice. The dead lanes were called dead not because nothing moved there, but because the living did not choose them unless forced. The corridors between stars had currents of traffic like rivers, and trade routes like roads, and safe translation paths like well-worn trails. The dead lanes were the places between those places, the stretches where old wrecks drifted, where radiation belts made sensors lie, where warp eddies curled like invisible hooks. In the Halo Verge, dead lanes had a darker reputation. Ships that entered sometimes returned with their crews shattered by inexplicable fear. Ships that entered sometimes did not return at all. Rowan kept their emissions low. He forced the ship into a cold crawl, using minimal thrust and letting inertia do the work. Every time he considered activating the main engines, he imagined coalition scopes catching their heat signature like a beacon. The coalition spearhead that had been chasing them might be far, or it might not. In the Halo Verge, distance meant little if warp currents twisted. On the second stretch of their crawl through the dead lanes, the first fight came not from an enemy fleet, but from scavengers. They appeared as a smear on sensors, small craft, low emission, hugging the particulate haze. Rowan almost missed them until Sable's patched sensor array flagged an irregularity in the drift patterns. 3 ships, then 5, then a dozen, their signatures mismatched like a pack of wolves drawn from different litters. Their hulls were patched, their drive signatures inconsistent, their transponder codes either dead or false. They were not coalition, they were worse in their own way because they were hungry without doctrine. Pirates? Sable asked over comm from engineering. Scavengers, Rowan replied, watching the visual feed resolve into harsh angles and welded plates. Reactors, they're sniffing us, they think we're a derelict. Vael's voice came softly from behind him. To them, you are. Rowan keyed the internal. Sable, bring point defense up to full. Keep it tight, no broad sweeps. I want them to think we're asleep until they're close enough to regret curiosity. Sable's laughter crackled through the comm. It was the first laugh Rowan had heard since waking, and it was thin but real. Copy, waking the teeth. The small ships moved in, cautious at first, then bolder. Rowan watched them fan out in a loose crescent, testing angles, probing for weak points. One of them, a needle-shaped craft with a glowing ram spike, accelerated toward the Vaelbright's starboard flank. Boarding attempt, Rowan said. Vael's eyes reflected the incoming craft. They are not coalition. No, Rowan said, just opportunists. The ram spike hit the hull with a sound that traveled through the ship's bones. Metal screamed. The deck shuddered, and alarms blossomed like red flowers across Rowan's console. A pressure drop warning flashed. Rowan's stomach tightened. In a healthy ship, a boarding attempt was an annoyance. In a wounded ship, it was a death sentence. Hull breach imminent, Sable warned. Rowan's jaw clenched. Not if we cut them first. He fired the point defense grid. The Vaelbright's remaining turrets snapped to life, spitting tight streams of kinetic rounds that stitched through space with brutal precision. The needle craft detonated in a blossom of fire and shards. 2 more ships veered away, then swung back, trying to stay under the guns' arcs, trying to approach from angles where the point defense lagged. Pirates were clever in the way hunger made you clever. They learned quickly where a wounded beast could not turn. A second ram craft struck closer to the engine ring. A third slid along the dorsal ridge, clamping like a tick. Rowan felt each impact in his teeth. 2 clamps, Sable said. They're digging in. Rowan stood, the captain's chair creaking under the sudden absence of his weight. I'm going to meet them. Sable's voice sharpened over comm. Rowan, we can't let them cut into the core, Rowan said. If they find it alive, they'll strip us and we'll never get back. Vael rose as well, moving with that quiet grace that made Rowan's skin prickle. You will die, Vael said, not as threat, but as statement. Rowan looked at him. Maybe. Vael's throat lines brightened faintly, not quite in mockery, not quite in respect. Then I will accompany you. I would rather not be left alone with your mechanical priest. Sable's comm snapped with irritation. I heard that. Rowan grabbed a rifle from the emergency rack, checked the charge, then moved into the corridor that led toward the breach site. The ship's gravity flickered, turning each step into a negotiation. The emergency lights painted the walls like bloodless sunset. Somewhere ahead, metal shrieked as cutting torches bit into hull plating. The sound made Rowan's jaw clench. Cutting through a capital ship's hull was not easy. It took time, which meant the scavengers believed they had time. That belief was the arrogance of the desperate. Rowan and Vael moved together in uneasy rhythm, human and alien, enemies forced into the same narrow hallway by the indifference of space. Rowan could feel Vael's presence like a cold flame, controlled and watchful. It would have been comforting if it weren't also a reminder of everything that had led them here. Vael walked without hesitation, as if he already knew the ship's layout, as if he had mapped it during his earlier wandering. Rowan did not like that. He also did not have the luxury of stopping it. They reached the breach site, a maintenance bay with an outer bulkhead now blistered and glowing. Sparks fell like bright insects. A jagged seam opened as the scavenger's cutter finally broke through, and a gust of cold vaporized the moisture in the air into a sudden fog. The ship's emergency seals began to close, but the breach was too wide and the mechanisms too slow, the bay filled with swirling frost and the taste of vacuum. Shapes emerged, 3 figures in patched pressure suits, faces hidden behind scratched visors. One carried a plasma torch like a spear. Another held a short, brutal firearm. The third dragged a cable spool, ready to latch and reel to pull salvage out like teeth from a skull. Rowan raised his rifle. "Back off," he called, and his voice sounded steadier than he felt. The lead scavenger tilted his head, then laughed, the sound distorted through comm speakers, harsh with delight. "It's alive," the scavenger said, awe and greed braided together. "Big one, we're rich," Rowan fired. The first shot took the lead scavenger in the shoulder, spinning him back. The second hit the torch, exploding it into a white flare that lit the bay like lightning. The other 2 surged forward anyway, because greed did not require wisdom. One fired blindly, rounds chewed into the bulkhead, showering sparks. Rowan moved to the side, using a support strut as cover, firing controlled bursts. He did not empty the rifle in panic. He did not scream. He had been trained too well for that, and training was the only thing holding his mind together now. Vael moved beside Rowan with sudden fluidity, his long limbs snapping into action. He did not carry a weapon, but he didn't need one. He closed the distance on the second scavenger with the gun, slipping under the line of fire as if he could see the bullets before they were fired. He seized the scavenger's gun arm, twisted, and the joint bent in a direction joints were not designed to go. The scavenger's scream came sharp and ugly. Vael shoved him into the breached seam, and for a moment the scavenger hung half in, half out, pinned by jagged metal and the suction of thin air, thrashing like a hooked fish. Rowan shot the third scavenger through the visor. The suit depressurized in a violent, silent bloom. The body collapsed like a marionette with cut strings, drifting for a heartbeat before the bay's emergency seals finally slammed down and caught it in a stuttering wind. The fog thickened, swirling around the corpse like a shroud. The wounded lead scavenger tried to crawl away, dragging himself toward the breach, leaving a faint smear on the deck where his suit leaked. Rowan stepped forward, rifle aimed. The scavenger's helmet turned toward him, visor cracked, eyes visible through the frost. They were human eyes, bloodshot and wide with fear. "Please," the scavenger said, voice raw. "Please, we didn't know." Rowan hesitated. He saw, in that moment, not an enemy fleet, not doctrine, not ideology, but a starving human-shaped thing trying to survive in the Verge's shadow. He remembered the half-eaten meal in the mess deck, the photograph he'd tucked into his pocket, the crew that had ceased. He thought of Captain Merrick's voice, "We hold a line even when no one is watching." He did not know if anyone was watching now, but the ship itself felt like witness. He lowered the rifle a fraction. "Get off my ship," he said. "Now." The scavenger stared, disbelieving. Then he scrambled backward, dragging himself toward the breach, desperation lending him speed. He vanished into the darkness beyond the sealed bulkhead as his companions' grapples released and their ships pulled away. Vael watched with a stillness that felt like judgment. "You spare him," Vael said softly. Rowan swallowed. "He's not my war." Vael's throat lines pulsed. "Interesting." They returned to the bridge bruised and breathless, and Sable met them there with a look that was half relief and half fury. She had grease on her face and blood on her sleeve, and her hair had come loose from its tie, making her look wilder than before. "You're bleeding," she snapped at Rowan, and her eyes flicked to his ribs where his shirt was torn. He glanced down. A line of blood seeped through the fabric where a fragment of metal had caught him during the fight. He hadn't noticed until she pointed it out. Adrenaline had been a better painkiller than any medkit. "Later," he said, because that word was becoming a habit, a way to shove the cost down the road and hope the road was long enough. Sable's eyes flicked to Vael. "And you're not." Vael inclined his head. "Your commander is efficient." Sable's mouth tightened. "So are knives." Rowan sank into the captain's chair again, feeling the ship's tremors settle. On sensors, the scavenger craft scattered, fleeing like startled fish. The dead lanes returned to their silent drift. But Rowan couldn't shake the feeling that the fight had been an announcement. The universe had noticed them moving. The Halo Verge, with its warped physics and its old rumors, felt less like empty space and more like a presence that had turned its head. That night, if night meant anything, Rowan sat alone on the bridge, watching the starfield fragments and the faint pulsing of the Halo Verge haze. The ship moved with slow, minimal thrust, and the hum of the engines was like a tired sigh. The emergency lights cast long shadows. He replayed the scavenger's plea in his mind and felt both relief and unease. Mercy was not free either. Mercy could be a signal. Mercy could be remembered by the wrong people. He opened the ship log again and began to record, voice low. Ship log. We have been engaged by scavenger craft. Boarding attempt repelled. 1 hostile spared. Damage minimal. Crew still missing. We continue cold crawl toward potential relay corridor. He paused, fingers resting on the console. The whisper in the comm static was there again, faint, persistent, like breath on the back of his neck. He tried to isolate it with filters and noise reduction. The system refused, or perhaps it could not. The sound slipped through algorithms like water through fingers. Vael stood nearby, arms folded, gaze distant. He had been quiet since the fight, and Rowan suspected the alien was turning something over in his mind, like a stone examined for cracks. Why are you really here? Rowan asked suddenly. Not on my ship, in this mess. Why did your coalition come for us? Vael's eyes shifted, black and reflective. In the emergency light, they looked like deep water. You burn too hot, he said. You spread. You do not accept fences. You do not accept that the galaxy has owners. Rowan let out a quiet laugh. The sound was bitter. Owners. Vael's throat lines dimmed. Order requires boundaries. And life requires breath, Rowan replied. He stared at the stars, at the haze like a bruise. We're going to get back, and when we do, whatever your coalition thinks, we'll still be here. Vael watched him for a long moment, then turned his gaze to the warped horizon where the Verge's haze thickened. Perhaps, he said, almost reluctantly. Perhaps that is your curse, or your gift. Rowan looked at him, and for a heartbeat he saw Vael not as prisoner, not as enemy, but as another survivor trapped in a story he did not fully understand. The thought unsettled him. He did not want to find kinship with the coalition. But the Halo Verge had stripped away many comforts already, and the comforts left might be stranger than he liked. What did you mean? Rowan asked quietly. When you said the ship has been touched? Vael did not answer at once. He stepped closer to the viewport and looked out at the particulate haze drifting like ash. There are places, he said finally, where warp is not simply distance folded. There are places where it is memory, scar tissue. Your people have only been among the stars a short time. You think the universe is new. It is very old, Commander, old enough to learn habits. Rowan felt the cold hand of dread tighten. Habits? Vael's throat lines pulsed faintly. To take, to keep, to listen. As if in response, the calm static thickened. The whisper rose slightly, not louder but clearer in shape, like a hand pressing closer to glass. Rowan's breath caught. He stared at the console and saw, for an instant, the diagnostic lights flicker in that strange alphabet again, patterns that made no engineering sense but felt like language. He thought of the crew of Captain Merrick, of the helmsman, of the mess deck laughter, of the photographs and letters and small carved figures. He thought of the ship swallowing them whole and leaving only absence behind. His throat tightened with grief that had nowhere to go. Sable's voice came through comm from engineering, rough with fatigue. Bridge, this is Ilyan. Auxiliary reactors holding. Thrusters are steady at minimal. We're okay for now. Rowan cleared his throat. Copy, he said. Good work. There was a pause on the line, the kind that carried what people didn't say. Then Sable's voice softened just a fraction. Rowan, don't do that thing you do. He knew what she meant. Don't take the whole weight alone. Don't get noble. Don't turn into a statue. I won't, he lied gently, because some lies were kindness. When the comm line clicked off, Rowan sat back in the captain's chair and let his head rest against the broken armrest's jagged edge for a moment, careful not to cut himself. He stared at the starfield and the haze and felt the ship's slow movement through the dead lanes like the crawl of a wounded beast through tall grass. Somewhere out there were scavengers who had tasted their blood. Somewhere out there, perhaps, were coalition ships that might one day catch the scent Vael spoke of. Somewhere out there was the fleet, if the fleet still lived, a moving hearth of human voices and orders and imperfect laughter. He wanted to be back among them more than he could admit. He wanted to hear calm chatter again, to complain about shifts, to argue about tactics, to see a crowded mess deck and feel annoyed by it, because annoyance meant ordinary life. Ordinary life was a gift you only appreciated after it was gone. He looked down at his shirt where the blood seeped slowly, a thin, dark line. He pressed a hand to it and felt the sticky warmth. Later, he murmured again, and the word tasted like debt. The Vaelbright crawled onward through the dead lanes, wounded and stubborn, carrying 3 lives where once it had carried thousands. Behind them, the dead lanes closed like water. Ahead, the haze thickened and thinned in slow currents, and the Halo Verge waited with patient indifference. And somewhere in the folds of the wound, something listened, not with ears, but with the slow attention of old things that had learned the sound of living creatures trying to return home. They made a life out of small numbers and smaller mercies, and the ship learned their footsteps the way an old house learns the habits of the last family living in it, listening for the hinge that squeaks, the board that complains, the pause before a door is shut with care. On the Vael there had once been so many feet that no single tread mattered. Now 3 sets of steps became a pattern, and the corridors seemed to hold their breath when those steps approached. Rowan set their days, if days could be trusted in a place where clocks argued like drunks, into a hard rotation that left little room for thinking. 2 hours to check life support, 2 to scan the lanes, 2 to inspect seals and bulkhead stress points, 2 to eat, 2 to sleep. And then the hours repeated like a prayer repeated by someone who cannot remember what faith feels like, but refuses to stop moving their lips. He kept logs because a man with a pen still believes in tomorrow, and because the act of recording, of putting sense into words, was a fence he could build around the panic gnawing the edges of his mind. Sable kept the ship alive with stubborn ingenuity and a kind of profanity that could have been hymnal if you listened long enough. She would vanish into the engineering decks for stretches that might have been 12 hours or 20, time drift made liars of schedules, and return with fresh bruises, a new burn on her forearm, coolant on her cheek like war paint, and the grim satisfaction of someone who had wrestled a stubborn machine into cooperation. Vael remained at the bridge's periphery, his presence like a cold candle, light without warmth, watchful, steady, and always just far enough from them that he could pretend he was not part of the same fragile circle. He kept his distance, but distance did not prevent questions. His questions came like needles, thin and precise, slipped under armor where a blade would have been noticed too soon. Why do you ration as though you will be here months? He asked the first time Rowan reduced their meal portions, dividing ration packs into thirds with a careful hand. Rowan looked at the bland nutrient paste, at the small pile of hard biscuits that tasted like dust and salt, and felt his own anger rise like bile. Because if I ration like we'll be home tomorrow, we'll die on the day after, he said. Because hope doesn't fill lungs. Vael's throat lines pulsed faintly. Hope makes you do strange things. Your species clings to it like a drowning animal clings to wreckage. Rowan nearly snapped back that they were drowning, but the words stuck, because in the Halo Verge drowning did not look like thrashing water. It looked like quiet corridors and empty chairs and a ship breathing through damaged lungs. Instead, he swallowed and wrote the ration numbers into his log, because argument was heat, and heat was something they could not afford. Sable, overhearing from the doorway, only grunted and took her share without complaint, her mouth set in that hard line she wore when she was refusing to let pain become personality. The grief did not leave them. It did not even soften. It settled into the ship like dust in corners, quiet and persistent, and it rode their routines like an undertow, pulling at ankles when they tried to stand steady. Rowan found himself collecting the traces of the missing crew as he made his rounds, not in a sentimental way. He hated sentiment when it threatened to paralyze, but in the way a man gathers kindling before winter, because the smallest things could keep the mind burning. A glove found near the comm station. A torn patch with a name half burned off. A child's drawing tucked into a locker door, a crude ship with a smiling sun and a stick figure family beneath it. He made a place for them in a maintenance closet off the central spine, clearing out spare insulation and cracked tools and setting the items in neat rows, as if order could serve as apology. He did not pray over them. He did not say names aloud, because saying names felt like summoning, and he did not know what listened in this wound. But he arranged the objects anyway, and when he closed the closet door he felt, for a heartbeat, that he had closed something else too, some small gate inside him that wanted to collapse. Sable pretended not to notice the closet at first. Then, one cycle when the ship's gravity was particularly unstable and the corridors seemed to bend in ways the maps refused to admit, Rowan found her standing in front of the closet door with her wrench hanging loose at her side, her expression blank in the way people look when they are holding back something larger than themselves. She did not open it. She just stood there, and the emergency light painted her face in amber and shadow, making her look older. "You doing all right?" Rowan asked, knowing the question was both useless and necessary. Sable's jaw tightened. "No," she said, and the honesty of it was sharp. Then she cleared her throat and added, as if duty could patch the tear, "Aux reactor S running hotter. I've got a bypass that should keep it from spiking, but it's going to eat seals faster. Rowan nodded, accepting the report because accepting it was a way to say I hear you without saying it. Do what you need. I always do, she said, and then she walked away with that stubborn sway she had when she was hurt but refusing to limp. Vael watched these small human rituals with an expression that might have been disdain if it were not so intent. He did not mock the closet. He did not comment on the drawing. But once, when Rowan came out of that maintenance compartment and found Vael in the corridor as if he had been waiting, the alien spoke quietly, almost to himself. You build shrines, he said. Even in steel. Rowan met his gaze. We build reminders, he replied, so we don't become the kind of thing that forgets. Vael's throat lines dimmed, and he looked away as if the words had struck somewhere inconvenient. The dead lanes began to show their teeth the way a quiet animal reveals it is not tame, not all at once, not with a roar, but with small signs that grew harder to ignore. At first it was the sensor returns. Faint wakes trailing behind them on the tactical overlay, the signature of a ship's passage, but there were no ships in sight, no emissions, no shapes against the haze. Rowan would run diagnostics, recalibrate, curse the broken array, and the wakes would vanish, only to reappear in a different band, as if the lane itself wanted to be seen. Once, Rowan watched a ghost wake peel away from the Vaelbright's own signature and drift off to starboard like a loose skin, moving with the same slow crawl. He blinked, ran the sweep again, and the wake was still there, a pale echo of their path. The whisper in the calm static thickened when that happened, and Rowan found his fingers tightening on the console until his knuckles hurt. False positives, he told himself aloud, because a spoken lie sometimes steadied the air. Debris interference. Vael stood behind him, silent, and did not correct him, which was worse than correction. Then there were the wrecks. In the Halo Verge you could not go far without seeing the bones of other ships, some human, some not, some old enough that their hull plating had become a dark lichen of micrometeor scars. Most wrecks were straightforward in their tragedy, split along a seam, engines gutted, compartments blown open. But some were wrong in a way that made Rowan's stomach sink. They bore gouges that did not look like weapon strikes or debris impacts. The marks were too deliberate, too smooth, carved in long curving lines that resembled writing more than damage. One drifting frigate hull, Terran by its frame, though the registry had been scraped away, had its entire dorsal surface etched with spirals that ran toward the center, converging on a point where the metal had been folded inward as if something had pressed a thumb into soft clay. Rowan stared at that wreck through the viewport, feeling the old part of him that loved ships, the crafted things, the honest things, flare into anger. Who did that? He murmured, though no one answered. The wreck did not look looted, it looked used. Sable came to the bridge then, her hands stained with oil and her eyes bright with exhaustion, and she followed Rowan's gaze. For a moment her face went slack, as if she had forgotten how to be angry. Then she swore, low and heartfelt. That's not weapons, she said. That's. Somebody took their time. Rowan turned slightly. You ever seen anything like it? Not outside old stories, she muttered. Not outside the kind of tales you tell rookies to scare them into staying on marked routes. Vael, who had been watching the wreck with an unnatural stillness, suddenly looked away. It was not the casual look away of someone bored. It was the sharp refusal of someone who had just seen a corpse he recognized. His throat lines dimmed to near darkness. Rowan noticed. Vael, he said carefully, you know what that is. Vael's jaw tightened in a way that made his elegant face look briefly animal. No, he said too quickly. Then, after a breath, he added, I have heard of places where such marks appear. Places like the Halo Verge, Sable said. Vael did not answer. He kept his gaze fixed on the far wall of the bridge on a point of shadow where emergency light did not reach. Do not stare at it, he said finally. Do not give it your attention. Rowan felt his skin prickle. Because it will stare back? Vael's throat lines pulsed faintly once. It might have been a yes. It might have been fear refusing to take the shape of agreement. Time drift became their constant companion, a quiet thief stealing certainty in handfuls. Rowan would finish a log entry and find that the timestamp had duplicated itself, 2 entries made 10 minutes apart claiming they had been written at the same moment. Sable would report she had been down in engineering for 3 hours, and Rowan's chronometer would insist it had been 7. The ship's internal clock would occasionally stutter, then jump forward in a way that made their stomachs drop, as if the deck had fallen away. Once, Rowan woke from a brief sleep cycle with the taste of iron in his mouth, and found that his hair was damp with sweat as though he had been running, but his muscles felt heavy and unused. The bridge displays flickered between star positions, as if the sky itself could not decide what era it belonged to. Rowan tried to keep the routines anyway. He had learned on long campaigns that discipline was not a virtue, it was a tool. It did not make you noble. It made you survive. In the quiet hours, he found himself imagining the missing crew not as dead, but as displaced, as if the anomaly had simply moved them into another corridor of the ship, a sealed compartment he had not checked yet. He caught himself doing it and felt a bitter laugh rise because he knew the lie even as he clung to it, but he did not throw it away. You did not throw away lies that kept you moving until you had something better. Vael watched him write. One cycle, Rowan could not have said whether it was the third or the fifth since the scavenger attack. Vael spoke again, quietly, as if he were testing whether his own voice could carry in this place without being stolen. You record everything, he said. Even things that will not matter if you die. Rowan did not look up. They matter now, he replied. Vael's throat lines pulsed. You think the act of recording is defiance. Rowan paused, fingers hovering over the console. He considered the empty captain's chair beside him, the snapped armrest, the impression of a hand that had gripped it in panic or rage. I think, he said slowly, that if something out here wants us to vanish clean, without trace, then leaving trace is a way of spitting in its eye. Vael did not respond. But for a moment, Rowan thought he heard that non-electrical whisper beneath the ship's hum, faint as breath on glass, and he felt the old instinct to look over his shoulder, as if the dark itself had leaned in closer. The near miss with the Coalition patrol began as a single clean signature on the sensor array, so disciplined and precise that it looked like sanity after weeks of ghosts. Rowan saw it and felt his heart drop anyway, because sanity in hostile space was often worse than madness. A frigate, Coalition-built, its drive emissions low and controlled, gliding along the edge of the dead lane with the patient hunting posture of a predator that had learned the smell of prey. It did not broadcast. It did not flare. It simply moved, scanning, listening, and Rowan imagined the officers inside it, if they called them officers. Coalition hierarchy had different words, standing at their consoles with calm certainty, trusting in doctrine and mathematics. Contact, Rowan said, and his voice went flat with training. He keyed comm to engineering. Sable, kill everything you can, we're going dark. Sable's reply came instantly. Already ahead of you, Ox reactor is going to hate me. Let it hate, Rowan muttered. He began shutting down systems with a careful hand, reducing emissions to the bare minimum needed to keep air cycling. The bridge lights dimmed further, and the hum of the ship dropped into a near silence that felt like holding one's breath underwater. Vael stepped closer to the sensor display, his black eyes reflecting the frigate's moving signature. It hunts, he said softly. Rowan's jaw tightened. We hide, he said, as if saying it made it true. He maneuvered the Vaelbright behind a drifting field of debris, broken hull plates, ice-laced rock, the scattered bones of some long-ago disaster. He tucked the capital ship into shadow the way a deer tucks itself under trees, trusting stillness more than armor. The Vaelbright was enormous, hiding her was like hiding a mountain. But the dead lane haze and the debris field gave him a chance, and chance was all he had. The frigate's scan pattern widened, a slow sweep like a flashlight moving over a dark room. Rowan watched the sensor overlay as if staring hard could make it lie in their favor. He felt sweat prickling under his collar despite the cold. Sable's voice came through calm, low, and tense. Everything's down to life support and minimal nav. If we need thrust? I know, Rowan said. He didn't want to think about thrust. Thrust meant heat. Heat meant a beacon. The frigate drifted closer. Its scan sweep tightened. Rowan could almost imagine its sensors tasting the lane, parsing the particulate haze, looking for anomalies. The ship did not behave like scavengers. Scavengers circled and poked and lunged. The Coalition frigate was patient. It did not hurry because it did not need to. Vael's throat lines pulsed faintly, then dimmed. It smells, he said, and the word carried a kind of revulsion. Rowan's eyes flicked toward him. Smells what? Vael's gaze remained fixed on the frigate. The wound leaves a scent on hulls, he said. Not in the way your noses understand, but in the way warp understands. Residue, a mark, you have it. Rowan felt his stomach twist. So we're tagged. Yes, Vael said simply. You pass through torn space. It clings to you. We can mask heat. We can mask sound. But the wound, his throat lines flickered. The wound writes on you. Rowan's hand tightened on the console. Can they track it? Vael did not look at him. If they are close enough, he said. If their instruments are tuned. The frigate's scan tightened again. Its trajectory shifted slightly, angling toward the debris field that hid the Vaelbright. Rowan's heart hammered. He imagined the coalition ship's sensors catching a faint warp residue like a dog catching scent on wind. The scan paused, lingered. Sable's voice came again, sharper now. Rowan, we're going to have to move. There. I know, Rowan whispered, and the whisper felt like prayer. He watched the overlay. The frigate's scan did not pass on. It hovered, uncertain, as if the hunter had caught a smell but could not find the trail. Rowan held his breath until his lungs burned. Then the frigate moved closer anyway, slow and sure, and Rowan realized with sudden clarity that hiding was not enough. The coalition did not need certainty to close the net. It only needed patience. The choice came like a blade sliding into his mind: move and be seen, or stay and be found. He thought of Captain Merrick's snapped chair. He thought of the scavengers' plea. He thought of the crew's absence and the closet shrine in the spine. He felt the weight of command not as glory but as obligation. He turned slightly, catching Sable's eyes in the dimness. Even through the grainy comm feed on his console, he could see her face, taut and furious. "We're not outrunning them," she said. Rowan swallowed. "No." Her voice dropped, almost a growl. "Don't even think about it." He almost laughed because she knew him too well. "We don't have another trick," he said. "There's always another trick," Sable snapped. "It's called fix the ship and don't drive into ghost stories." Rowan's gaze flicked to the starboard viewport, where the particulate haze thickened into a faint shimmer, a boundary line that the sensors treated like static. The verge edge, the place where warp and real space began to disagree loudly. They had skirted it since waking, keeping a careful distance, like travelers keeping away from a cliff edge in fog. Now it loomed as a possible door. The frigate moved again, closer still. Its scan swept the debris field with more intensity, and Rowan saw a brief spike on the sensor overlay, an anomaly, a whisper of residue. He felt his mouth go dry. "We cross," he said. Sable's face on the comm display turned hard. "No, Rowan, we don't have time," he replied. "We're tagged." "We go quiet and drift," she said. "We let them pass." "They won't pass," Rowan said, and his voice came out low and steady, the voice of the man he became when fear stopped being useful. "They'll keep closing until they touch us." Sable's eyes flashed. "And if you take us into that shimmer, it won't be the coalition that kills us. It'll be," she swallowed, and the engineer in her fought with the superstitious part that didn't want to name it. "It'll be whatever took the crew." Vael spoke then from the shadows near the viewport, and his voice carried a reluctant honesty that made Rowan's skin prickle. "You will die," Vael said. Then, after a pause, he added, "but the coalition will not follow deep." Sable's gaze snapped toward him as if she wanted to throw the wrench through the comm line. "How do you know?" Vael's throat lines dimmed. "Because we have lost ships there," he said quietly. "Because order does not like places where order dissolves." Rowan felt a cold calm settle over him, the kind that came before hard maneuvers, before boarding actions, before battle. He knew the risks. He knew the ship might unravel. He knew his mind might crack. He also knew that if he did nothing, the coalition frigate would eventually put a tether into them and tow them back as prize, and then their story would end in a cell or an airlock. He keyed thrust to the bare minimum needed to move the Vailbright out of the debris shadow. The ship shuddered as if protesting, and Rowan felt the hulls groan through his boots. He angled them toward the shimmer. Sable's voice came through calm like a knife. "Rowan, if you do this and I'm wrong, I will personally haunt you." Rowan swallowed. "If we live, you can haunt me all you like." "Terran humor," Vael murmured, and there was something like disbelief in it. The coalition frigate's scan spiked again as the Vailbright moved. The hunter had seen the deer step out from behind the trees. The frigate adjusted course, accelerating just slightly, enough to close distance. Rowan watched the range numbers tick down and felt the inevitability of pursuit settle like a weight. He pushed them into the shimmer. At first, nothing happened. The boundary line was faint, a visual distortion in the haze, like heat shimmer over desert sand. The sensors crackled and spat error codes. Then the ship crossed fully, and reality did what it did in the Halo Verge when you tried to insist on rules. It laughed quietly, without sound, and then it began to rewrite. Gravity flipped. Not gently, not with a smooth rotation, but with a brutal jerk that threw Rowan sideways against his console. Pain flared in his ribs, bright and immediate. His teeth clacked together hard enough that he tasted blood. The bridge lights flickered, and for a moment the emergency halos became a strobing nightmare. The deck became the ceiling. The ceiling became the wall. Rowan's stomach lurched as if his organs were trying to escape. He grabbed the edge of the console and held on, muscles straining, while the ship's inertial dampeners screamed in protest and failed, then caught, then failed again. The calm static thickened into a roar, and beneath it the whisper rose, no longer faint. It pressed into Rowan's ears with the intimacy of someone leaning close to speak a secret. For a heartbeat he thought he heard words, Terran words, and his skin went cold because the voice was familiar. "Kepler," it said, soft and sharp at once. "Rowan," his breath caught. He turned his head wild-eyed and saw, only for a moment, the outline of Captain Merrick standing by her chair, her hair loose, her face pale in the emergency light. She looked exactly as she had the last time Rowan had seen her, calm even in chaos, eyes hard with command. Her mouth moved, and Rowan felt something in him tear. "Captain," he whispered, and the word broke on his tongue. The figure flickered like a bad transmission, then vanished. The chair remained empty, broken, indifferent. Rowan's heart hammered. He forced himself to look back at his instruments because looking for ghosts was a fast way to die. Across the ship, Sable screamed. The sound came over comm not as a clean transmission, but as a warped, doubled echo, layered on itself, as if the ship were trying to repeat it from different moments at once. "No, no, where are you?" Sable's voice broke, and Rowan heard other voices beneath it, faint, overlapping like a crowd calling from far away. Crew voices, laughter, shouting, a song someone had been humming in the mess. The ship poured these sounds into the comm channel like water pouring out of a cracked jar. Rowan's hands shook. He keyed the comm. "Sable, Sable, answer me, status." Her reply came strained, breathless. Rowan, I can hear them," she gasped. "I can hear the crew, they're in the walls, there." Her voice broke into a sob she tried to swallow. "They're calling my name." Rowan felt his throat tighten with grief so sharp it was almost physical. "It's not them," he said, though he did not know if he was lying. "It's the ship. It's interference. Hold on to your work. Don't listen." "How the hell do I not listen?" Sable choked out, and the question was both rage and prayer. Vael stood very still behind Rowan, his throat lines pulsing in rapid patterns that made his skin look like embers flaring in wind. He did not speak. He did not move. Rowan realized with sudden unease that the alien's usual composure had cracked. Vael was afraid, and Vael did not know how to hide it in this place. "What do you hear?" Rowan asked him without turning because he was afraid of what he might see if he looked fully at Vael's face. Vael's voice came quiet, strained. "Older," he said. "Not yours, not mine." He swallowed, and the motion made his throat lines flare. "A pressure, a tide. It speaks without language. It asks—" He stopped, as if the act of naming would make it real. "It asks what you are willing to lose." Rowan's mouth went dry. He tried to focus on the sensor overlay, but the overlay had become nonsense. Star positions shifting, range numbers spiking and falling, trajectories bending like reeds in wind. Outside the viewport, the haze had thickened into something like a slow storm, luminous threads sliding past like the veins of some great living thing. The stars beyond looked wrong, as if seen through water. The ship's clock began to tick backward. Rowan's hands tightened on the console until his fingers hurt. He forced himself to breathe. "Hold," he murmured, though he did not know whether he was commanding the ship or himself. "Just hold." For a while, minutes, hours, the concept was slippery, they drifted in the shimmer, and the ship groaned as if being twisted. The bulkheads creaked, and Rowan felt the vibration through the soles of his boots as if the ship were trying to speak in pain. The whisper in the comm channel rose and fell, sometimes forming almost words that dissolved before he could catch them. Once Rowan heard a child laugh, clear as day, and his vision blurred as he remembered the drawing in the closet shrine. A stick family beneath a smiling sun. He nearly turned, nearly ran from the bridge to the shrine like a man chasing a sound in the night, but he forced himself to stay, because a commander who abandoned the helm in a storm did not deserve the title. Then, without warning, the distortion loosened. Gravity stuttered, flipped once more, then settled into a shaky imitation of normal. Bridge lights steadied, the calm static thinned. The whisper retreated into faintness again, like something satisfied that it had been heard. Rowan sucked in a breath as if surfacing from deep water. He ran diagnostics with shaking hands. The ship's readings were still wrong, but less violently so. The sensor overlay began to resolve into something coherent. The Coalition frigate's signature was gone. Rowan leaned forward, scanning. Nothing. No disciplined hunter. No patient scan sweeps. No closing net. "They didn't follow," he whispered. Sable's voice came over calm, hoarse, as if she had been screaming into a pillow. "They didn't," she confirmed. "Whatever this place is, even they don't want it." Vael exhaled slowly, and Rowan realized with a jolt that Vael had been holding his breath in some alien way, throat lines dimmed to near darkness. "They fear deep verge," Vael said, voice tight. "It unthreads things." Rowan stared at the sensor readouts, at the ship's battered status, and felt a grim satisfaction that tasted like ash. They had lived, but living in the Halo Verge always felt like stealing, and thieves did not keep what they stole without consequence. The consequence arrived almost immediately. The port stabilizer, already wounded, began to fail in earnest as the ship returned to the dead lane's more stable drift. The diagnostic lights flashed that foreign alphabet again, the patterns pulsing faster like a heart racing. A warning alarm sounded, and Rowan felt the ship's nose dip slightly as if the Vaelbright were suddenly tired of holding her own weight. "Sable," Rowan said, already knowing. "Talk to me." Sable did not answer at first. Rowan heard the clatter of tools through the comm line, heard her breathing, too fast, too controlled. Then she said, "We lost 3 relays in the stabilizer array. The Verge transit cooked them. The dampeners are compensating, but they're overheating. If I don't get down there and reroute—" She stopped, and Rowan could hear pain in her throat, not physical but deeper, the pain of knowing what her ship needed and how little time they had. Rowan pushed himself out of the captain's chair, his ribs protesting. He felt the sticky warmth of dried blood under his shirt where the scavenger fight had cut him. The wound tugged when he moved. He ignored it because ignoring was easier than dealing. "I'm coming," he said. "You stay on the bridge," Sable snapped instantly. "You keep eyes out, I fix." Rowan hesitated. He had been trained to command, not to crawl into machinery. But command in a ship with 2 humans and 1 enemy was not the same as command in a ship with thousands. "Sable," he said quietly, "you can't do it alone." Sable's silence was brief, sharp, then she exhaled like someone swallowing pride. "Fine," she said. "But if you get yourself killed in my engine room, I swear—" "You'll haunt me," Rowan said, and heard, to his surprise, a thin laugh in her reply. He left Vael on the bridge with a warning that was less threat than habit. "Don't touch anything," he said. Vael's eyes followed him, reflecting the bridge's dim lights. "I would not know which of your levers will kill you faster," Vael replied, and there was almost humor in it. Rowan made his way down to the stabilizer access corridor with careful speed, because the ship had begun to shudder in a low, constant tremor that made ladders sway like reeds. The corridor smelled of heated metal. The air grew warmer as he neared the stabilizer housing, and he began to taste the sharp tang of overheated circuitry. Sable was already there, half inside an open panel, her legs braced, her upper body swallowed by the ship's guts. A portable lamp threw harsh light over her back, making the grease on her uniform shine. "Hold this," she barked, shoving a tool case toward him without looking. Rowan grabbed it, set it down, and crouched beside her. He could hear the stabilizer array whining, a high-strain note that made his teeth ache. Sable's hands moved fast, wrenching cables free, splicing others, slapping a new bypass onto a relay that looked half-melted. Her bandaged arm was bleeding again, darkening the wrap. She did not seem to notice. "This is a mess," she muttered. "This is a goddamn Rowan, look at this." She pulled out a relay module and held it up. The metal casing had warped, not as if from heat alone, but as if it had been softened and then reshaped. The edges bore faint lines, thin grooves that looked in the lamplight uncomfortably like the gouges on the drifting wreck outside. Rowan's stomach tightened. "That's not normal failure," he said. "No," Sable snapped. "No, it is not." She shoved the relay aside and reached deeper into the panel. A sudden spark jumped, bright and violent, and Sable jerked her hand back with a hiss. The smell of burnt flesh hit Rowan like a slap. "Sable, don't," she said, teeth clenched. She shook her hand once hard as if she could fling pain away. When she thrust it back into the panel, Rowan saw the skin on her forearm blistered red. She did not slow. Rowan felt helpless fury rise. "Let me. You don't know what you're doing," she snapped. "You'll die and then I'll be alone with a Keth and a haunted ship." She reached for a coolant line and twisted. The line hissed, releasing a burst of cold vapor that coated her fingers in frost. She did not flinch. "You want to help? Hold the lamp, hand me tools, shut up." Rowan swallowed his pride and did as she said, because pride did not tighten bolts. He held the lamp steady while she worked. His ribs ached. His shoulder twinged where he had been thrown against the console during the Verge transit. He tried not to think about it. Later, his mind insisted. Later. He watched Sable's hands, the sure brutality of her movements, and felt a fierce respect that cut through his grief like a blade. She was not heroic in the clean way stories made heroes. She was heroic in the way farmers are heroic when they plant again after drought, not because they believe the sky will be kind, but because planting is what you do if you want to live. Vael appeared in the corridor behind them, silent as a shadow. Rowan turned sharply, hand half-reaching for his sidearm, but Vael lifted both hands slightly, palms open in a gesture that might have meant peace or might have meant disdain. "The ship's motion has changed," Vael said quietly. "It shakes more. You are damaging yourselves." Sable did not look up. "We're fixing," she said, voice muffled by the panel. "Go back to your corner." Vael stepped closer anyway, and Rowan felt tension spike because in a narrow corridor proximity was threat. But Vael only watched, his eyes following Sable's hands. "You bleed for metal," he said. Sable's laugh came sharp and ugly. "Metal's all I've got left to bleed for." Vael's throat lines pulsed faintly, and Rowan saw something like reluctant understanding flicker across the alien's face. Vael did not offer help. He did not touch anything. He just stood there as witness, as if seeing a human burn herself on purpose was new data that his doctrine had not prepared him for. Sable finally slapped the panel shut with a clang. The stabilizer whine dropped in pitch, still strained but less desperate. The ship's tremor eased. Sable leaned back against the bulkhead and closed her eyes for a moment, breathing hard. When she opened them, they were bright and angry. "That'll hold," she said. "For now, everything holds for now." Rowan nodded. "For now," he echoed, and the phrase felt like a curse. They climbed back toward the bridge, and Rowan felt the ship's exhaustion in every vibration. The Vailbright was alive, but she was living on borrowed strength, like an animal running on a broken leg because stopping meant being eaten. The dead lanes stretched ahead, silent and cold, and Rowan kept their emissions low, their thrust minimal, their hope locked down tight where it would not flare. It was not enough to keep hunger from finding them again. The scavengers returned, not as a loose pack of desperate reactors, but as something organized, something that had learned from the first taste and come back with tools and tactics. Rowan saw them first as a ripple of movement in the haze, a pattern of faint emissions that flickered like fish scales. Then the sensor overlay filled with multiple signatures, too many for coincidence, too coordinated for mere chance. They approached from several vectors at once, spreading out to flank, to cut off retreat, to box the wounded ship in like butchers circling a bull. "Contact," Rowan said, and his voice was iron now, the iron you forged when fear had been used up. "Multiple craft, they're back." Sable's reply came instantly, as if she had been waiting for this. "Of course they are." Vael stood by the viewport, watching the sensor overlay with that unnerving stillness. "They learned," he said. Rowan's fingers flew over the console, bringing point defense online. The turrets responded sluggishly. The power draw made the lights flicker. "They're not just boarding," Rowan muttered, reading the signatures. "They've got missiles." "Missiles," Sable echoed, and Rowan could hear her moving in engineering, tools clattering. "On that junk?" "They're coordinated," Rowan said. He watched the enemy ships tighten formation. "They brought someone smart." The first missile volley came as small, bright flares against the haze, streaks of heat that made Rowan's skin prickle. Point defense snapped to life, spitting kinetic fire. A few missiles detonated at range, blooming like brief flowers. Others slipped through, low and fast, weaving like predators. One struck the Vailbright's dorsal ridge with a brutal thud that shook the bridge and made Rowan's shoulder scream in pain as he grabbed the console to steady himself. Alarms blossomed. A secondary explosion followed, and Rowan smelled burning insulation through the vents. Sable's voice came sharp. "They hit Deck 4. I've got pressure loss." "Seal it," Rowan said, already rerouting power. He angled the ship toward a nearby debris field, a thick cluster of broken hull fragments and ice-laced rock. "We go into the graveyard, make them chase where their missiles can't." Vail's eyes flicked toward him. "You steer a wounded giant into knives." Rowan's mouth twisted. "Better knives we can see than chains we can't." He pushed the thrusters harder than he liked. The engines complained, a deep shudder that ran through the hull. The ship moved, slow but deliberate, toward the debris field. The scavengers pursued, their smaller craft slipping between fragments with ugly grace. Another missile volley streaked in. Point defense fired again, but the grid was straining. Rowan could see the heat load rising, the power draw eating their reserves. A missile detonated close, showering the ship in shrapnel that rang against armor like hail. "Rowan," Sable warned, and her voice carried the strained edge of someone watching a reactor gauge climb. "If you keep firing point defense at that rate, we die either way," Rowan said through clenched teeth. He could feel the ache in his ribs, the sharp pull in his shoulder, but he forced his body to obey. Later, his mind whispered. Later. A grappling craft surged in close, spitting a line toward the Vailbright's flank. The line latched with a heavy jolt. Rowan cursed and tried to burn it off with point defense, but the line was close to the hull, and the turret's angles were limited. Another line shot out from a different ship, latching near the engine ring. The scavengers were anchoring them. "Clamps," Sable said, voice tight. "They're trying to stop us." Rowan glanced toward Vael. "With me?" he said, and the words were command and necessity. Vael's throat lines pulsed faintly. "Again," he said, and there was something like weary contempt in it, not at Rowan, but at the universe's persistence. He followed without argument. Rowan grabbed his rifle and moved into the corridor with the practiced speed of someone who had done this in better-lit wars. The ship's gravity flickered, but less violently than in the shimmer. Still, the flicker made each step uncertain, and uncertainty in close quarters was death. Vael moved beside him, longer strides adjusted to Rowan's pace with unsettling ease. They reached the breach site quickly, another maintenance bay, this one closer to the dorsal ridge, where cutting torches were already biting into hull plating. Sparks fell like bright insects. The smell of hot metal filled Rowan's lungs. This boarding party was larger. 5 figures in patched suits, moving with practiced coordination. One carried a shield plate scavenged from some wreck, using it to deflect the first volley of rifle fire. Another carried a weapon that spat a harsh blue pulse ion, designed to stun systems and men alike. Rowan fired controlled bursts, aiming for joints, visors, weapons. He saw one scavenger spin back as a round shattered their elbow joint. Another stumbled as Rowan clipped their knee. But the shield bearer kept coming, and the ion weapon pulsed, striking the bulkhead near Rowan and sending a jolt through the air that made his teeth ache. Vael moved with that same cold efficiency as before, closing distance in a blur. He did not hesitate. He did not try to intimidate. He simply dismantled. He seized the shield's edge and ripped it aside with a strength that made Rowan's breath catch. The scavenger behind it stumbled forward, exposed, and Vael drove an elbow into their helmet with a crack that echoed like breaking stone. The scavenger dropped. Vael pivoted, caught another attacker's wrist, and twisted. Bone snapped. The attacker screamed, and Vael shoved them into the wall hard enough that their helmet visor crazed. Rowan's rifle bucked in his hands. He shot a third scavenger through the visor. The body collapsed, limp. The remaining 2 hesitated, and Rowan saw in their body language the flicker of realization. This was not a derelict. This was a living beast with teeth, and the beast had an alien among its last crew who fought like a machine. One scavenger, perhaps braver or perhaps simply more desperate, surged forward with a cutting torch aimed like a spear. Rowan stepped to intercept, and at that moment the ship's gravity stuttered, just a small flicker, but enough. His foot slid. The torch's hot edge scraped across Rowan's shoulder with a searing kiss. Pain exploded, white and immediate. Rowan grunted, swinging the rifle like a club. The blow connected with the scavenger's helmet, denting it. Vael struck at the same time, and the scavenger dropped, twitching. Rowan staggered back, his shoulder burning, his arm suddenly weak. He could feel blood seeping under his shirt, could smell scorched fabric. He clenched his jaw until his teeth hurt. Later, he told himself, though the word tasted like sand now. The last scavenger stumbled backward, hands raised, their visor cracked. "Wait, wait," they gasped, voice distorted. We just want." Rowan raised his rifle, and for a heartbeat he saw the first scavenger again, the one he had spared, crawling away through frost. He saw Captain Merrick's snapped chair. He saw the shrine closet. He saw Sable burning her arm to keep the ship alive. He thought of mercy and felt its weight. Vael's gaze turned toward Rowan, black eyes reflecting the emergency lights. There was no plea in Vael's face, no cruelty either, only cold expectation, as if death were simply the cleanest outcome. Rowan's breath came hard. "Get off my ship," he said again, and his voice was ragged with pain and stubbornness. "Tell the others this isn't free." The scavenger stared, then scrambled backward, dragging themselves toward the breach, leaving a faint smear of blood on the deck. They vanished into the cold beyond the emergency seal. When Rowan and Vael returned to the bridge, the scavenger ships were retreating, lines cut, clamps releasing under point defense fire. The Vaelbright drifted deeper into the debris field, hull scraping lightly against a fractured plate with a sound like teeth grinding. Rowan sank into the captain's chair, panting, his shoulder throbbing. The bridge smelled faintly of burnt insulation. The alarms quieted one by one into an uneasy silence. Sable's voice came through calm, rough. "Pressure stabilized, deck 4 sealed. We've got new damage, but we're not dead." Rowan swallowed. "Good," he said, though the word felt inadequate. He glanced down at his shoulder. Blood soaked the fabric. The pain pulsed with his heartbeat. He pressed his hand to it, felt the sticky warmth, and said the word he had been living on like a ration. "Later." Vael stood beside the viewport, watching the scavenger signatures fade into the haze. For a long moment he said nothing. Then he spoke, quietly, as if admitting something he did not like admitting. "They will return again," he said. "You have shown them you can be taken, but not easily. That makes you valuable." Rowan's laugh came out bitter. "We're a prize now." "You are a story now," Vael corrected, and the phrase landed strange in the bridge, heavy as iron and light as smoke. Rowan turned his head slightly, watching Vael's profile in the dim emergency glow. "You respect us yet?" He asked, and there was challenge in his voice and pain and a weary humor that tasted like blood. Vael did not look at him at first. His throat lines pulsed faintly, slow. "Respect," he said, as if tasting the word, as if considering how it fit. Then he turned and his black eyes met Rowan's. "Not for strength," Vael said. "Not for your weapons. Not even for your cruelty, though you have it in you. I respect you because you do not stop. Because your bodies break and you continue anyway." Rowan felt something shift in him, small but real, like a knot loosening. He looked away, back to the star-filled fragments, to the sensor overlay that still flickered with ghost wakes, to the haze that thickened like bruise-colored smoke. He thought of the Coalition frigate turning away from the shimmer. He thought of the whisper rising in the comm channel. He thought of the gouged wrecks. The Halo Verge did not feel like empty space anymore. It felt like a road, and roads had histories, and histories had thieves. He opened his log and began to write, because writing was how you kept the thief from stealing everything. His hand shook from pain and fatigue, but the letters formed anyway, stubborn as breath. "Ship log," he murmured, voice low. "We evaded Coalition patrol by crossing Verge Edge Shimmer. Transit caused further stabilizer damage and system degradation. Scavenger pack attacked with coordinated tactics. Repelled. Additional injuries sustained. Morale persists." He paused, listening. Beneath the static, the whisper stirred, faint and patient, as if amused by the word persists. Rowan's skin prickled. He leaned closer to the comm panel, trying to isolate it, trying to catch the shape of what it wanted. For a heartbeat, he thought he heard Captain Merrick's voice again, not clear, not whole, but the cadence of it. He swallowed hard and forced himself not to answer. Outside, the debris field drifted, silent and indifferent. The dead lanes stretched onward, and the Vaelbright limped through them with low thrust and lower hope, leaving behind a trail of conflict traces like blood drops on snow. In a place where even time could be stolen, violence was a kind of light, and light drew eyes. Rowan closed the log, pressed his hand again to his shoulder, and felt the wet warmth. "Later," he whispered, and the word sounded less like postponement now and more like a vow to survive long enough to pay the bill. They moved on because moving on was the only defiance left to them, and because somewhere ahead, somewhere beyond this thief road of stars, the fleet might still be burning its way through the dark, and the hearth of human voices might still exist. The Halo Verge listened, the way old wounds listen when fingers press against scar tissue, and the Vaelbright carried her 3 stubborn lives forward through the bruise-colored haze. The thief road had stolen something from them already, and it wasn't finished. Pain, Rowan learned, was not a single event but a weather system. It came in fronts and squalls, in false clear skies and sudden hail, and it moved through him with a stubborn intelligence that felt like spite. The scrape from the torch had been clean at first, heat and shock, a wound that bled and then quieted under bandage and grit, but the Halo Verge did not allow simple stories. In the hours after the scavenger pack fled, the burn had deepened into something angrier. His shoulder swelled, the skin around the cut tightened and shone, the muscles beneath it began to seize whenever he tried to lift his arm above his chest. By the time the Vaelbright crawled out of the debris field and back into thinner haze, the pain had found a rhythm with his heartbeat, a slow throb that made his vision pulse at the edges. He told himself later, because later had become his private religion, but the body does not attend sermons. It demands payment when it demands it, and it does not care how close you are to home. Sable noticed without being told. She noticed because she noticed everything that could fail, and in a ship reduced to 3 lives, she counted those lives the way an engineer counts remaining bolts before a hull patch. She watched him move on the bridge, the way his right hand hovered over the console as if afraid of weight, the way he held his arm tucked close to his ribs when he stood, the way he tried not to turn his torso too quickly. She did not say anything at first. Sable rarely wasted words on what she considered obvious. She only waited until he finished a sensor sweep and went to rise from the captain's chair, and then she stepped in front of him and put a hand on his chest. "Sit," she said. Rowan blinked at her, startled by the touch, by the simple authority of it. "We've got..." "Sit," she repeated, and the word was not a request. Her face was drawn tight, and there was a tremor at the corner of her mouth that might have been anger or exhaustion or both. "You're shaking." Rowan wanted to protest. He wanted to say that shaking was nothing, that shaking was the body's attempt to burn fear out through the skin. But when he looked down, he saw that his hand was indeed trembling, fine and persistent like a leaf on a wire. He sat back down slow, and the movement sent a bright spike through his shoulder that made him hiss through his teeth before he could stop himself. Sable's eyes narrowed. "There it is," she said, and there was no triumph in the words, only grim confirmation. "Take your shirt off." Rowan stared at her. "On the bridge?" "The bridge is a tomb right now," Sable snapped. "No one's coming in to be scandalized." Vael stood near the viewport, arms folded, his gaze angled away in the manner of someone pretending disinterest while absorbing everything. The alien's throat lines pulsed faintly, slow as tide. Rowan felt heat rise in his face, not from modesty, but from the old stubbornness of command. He had spent years being the one who told others to rest, to eat, to get patched up. Doing it himself felt like surrender. "Sable," he began, and then he coughed, because the air on the bridge was thin and dry, and his lungs had been irritated since the first Verge transit. Sable's voice softened just a fraction, not in kindness, but in the way a person softens an edge before pressing it deeper. "Rowan," she said, "if your arm locks up in the middle of a maneuver, we don't die heroically. We die stupidly. Let me look." He sat still, jaw clenched, and unfastened his uniform shirt with his left hand. The fabric pulled against the burned shoulder and came away with a sticky resistance. When he peeled it back, the bandage beneath was soaked through, darker than it should have been. Sable's breath hissed out between her teeth. She tore the bandage away with the briskness of a woman who believed hesitation was cruelty. The wound beneath was red and raw, the edges angry, the skin blistered in places where heat had kissed too long. Worse, there were faint dark lines radiating from it, thin as hair, like bruised veins spreading under the skin. Rowan swallowed. "That's infection," he said, keeping his voice steady because steady voices were the last shelter commanders had. Sable didn't answer immediately. She leaned closer, squinting, her grease-stained fingers hovering as if she could read the wound like a schematic. "It shouldn't be spreading like that," she muttered. "Not this fast." Rowan felt a coldness that had nothing to do with the ship. "The Verge," he said quietly. Sable's mouth tightened. "The Verge," she echoed, as if spitting the name could purge it. She grabbed a med kit from the bridge's emergency compartment, snapped it open, and began to work with clipped efficiency. She cleaned the wound with antiseptic that stung like fire, injected a broad-spectrum antibiotic pack into his upper arm, and then, after a moment's hesitation, added a second injector, the more expensive kind reserved for deep burns and nerve damage. Rowan flinched, jaw tightening, and Sable slapped his good shoulder lightly, not gentle but not unkind. "Breathe," she ordered. "You can do that, right? Commander still remembers how to breathe." Rowan forced a breath, then another. The ship's ventilation answered him with a ragged sigh, as if mocking the notion of remembering. Sable wrapped the wound in fresh gauze, then bound his shoulder with a brace strap to limit movement. When she finished, she stepped back, and for a moment she looked older than Rowan had ever seen her, older than her years, older than the war, older than the ship itself. Exhaustion sat on her like armor. "You've been running on spite," Rowan said, because he could see it now. The slight sway in her stance, the way her eyes blinked longer than necessary, the smear of coolant dried on her cheek from some earlier repair she had not bothered to clean. "When was the last time you slept?" Sable snorted. "When was the last time you did?" Rowan held her gaze. Sable, for a heartbeat, something fragile flickered in her eyes. Then she looked away toward the bridge consoles as if they could rescue her from the question. "I've been doing micronaps," she said, as if the phrase made it respectable. 10 minutes here, 20 there. Enough." "It's not enough," Rowan said. He heard the quietness in his own voice and hated it because quietness could sound like pleading. Sable's jaw worked. "If I sleep and something spikes, we lose the reactor," she said. "If we lose the reactor, we lose air. If we lose air, I know," Rowan said gently. "But if you don't sleep, you make a mistake. One mistake and I know," she snapped, and then the snap faded into a rough exhale. She leaned against the bulkhead, eyes closed for a moment. "All right," she said finally, like someone signing a contract with a devil. 2 hours, if you can keep the ship steady for 2 hours. "I can," Rowan said, though his arm throbbed and his head ached and his mind felt like it was made of frayed wire. Vael spoke then, quietly from the viewport. 2 hours is a long time in a place where time drifts," he said. Rowan's gaze flicked toward him. Then we count by breaths, Rowan replied, and there was more bite in the words than he intended. Or heartbeats, whatever you like. Vael's throat lines pulsed faintly, almost amused, but the amusement did not reach his eyes. Heartbeats can be stolen too, he said, and then he fell silent again, leaving the words hanging like a cold cloth. Sable left the bridge with reluctant steps, headed toward a small equipment closet near engineering where she had created a makeshift bunk out of folded insulation and spare straps. Rowan watched her go and felt the weight of responsibility settle heavier. Command was not a badge now, it was a shared breath, and he could not afford to waste any. He ran the next sensor sweep with one hand, moving slowly, careful not to jar his injured shoulder. The pain made his thoughts feel slightly distant, like he was operating through a layer of glass. Outside the ship, the dead lanes stretched in bruise-colored haze, dotted with drifting debris that glinted faintly when it caught starlight. The ghost wakes still appeared sometimes, faint signatures that mimicked ships, trailing behind them or sliding across their path like slow fish. Rowan tried to ignore them. He could not afford to chase every phantom. He kept their emissions low, their thrust minimal, their profile as forgettable as possible. Vael remained on the bridge, and in the dim emergency glow, his presence felt like another system, quiet, watchful, an instrument you did not understand but could not ignore. Rowan had been wary of leaving Vael alone with the bridge, and so he kept Vael in his peripheral vision while pretending not to. After a long stretch of silence, Vael spoke, his voice softer than usual. "You let her command you," Vael said. Rowan's lips tightened. "She's keeping the ship alive," he said, "so yes." Vael tilted his head slightly, as if considering. "In my people's doctrine, command is not shared," he said. "Hierarchy is a spine. If it bends, the body collapses." Rowan's gaze stayed on the sensor overlay. "Then your people haven't learned what humans learn," he said. "Spines bend so they don't break." Vael's throat lines dimmed. "That is an interesting philosophy for a species that breaks so often." Rowan felt irritation flare, then burn down into something quieter. "We break," he admitted, "and then we keep going." Vael did not answer. But a few minutes later, when Rowan muttered under his breath at the nav core's flickering errors, Vael leaned in slightly and pointed, two fingers hovering just above the display, not touching. "Your star catalog is attempting to match spectral signatures," Vael said. "But the Halo Verge shifts those signatures. If you adjust the tolerance to account for redshift variance in the particulate haze, you may gain a clearer match." Rowan looked at him, startled. "You know our nav algorithms?" Vael's eyes did not flicker. "Your technology is crude," he said, and then, perhaps sensing the human anger rising, he added, "but predictable. Crude things can be predictable. Predictable things can be manipulated." Rowan hesitated, then applied the adjustment. The nav display steadied slightly. A few star clusters aligned into something that resembled a corridor. It was not a clear route home, but it was more coherent than it had been. "Why help?" Rowan asked, keeping his voice low. "You've made it clear you're only observing." Vael's throat lines pulsed. "Because if you fail," he said, "I will be alone. Alone is inefficient." Rowan almost laughed. "Efficiency," he muttered, and the word felt like a foreign prayer. Still, he took the help. Survival did not allow pride. Pride was just another form of waste. Sable slept, and Rowan kept the ship steady by sheer will and careful calculations, and when his arm began to tremble with fatigue, he forced his left hand to take over more and more. He watched the ship's systems with the obsessive focus of a man guarding a fire in high wind. He listened to the calm static, always there, always whispering beneath, sometimes rising into shapes that almost formed names. Once, as the ship drifted past a shattered wreck whose hull bore those impossible spirals, Rowan heard a voice in the static that sounded like laughter, and his skin prickled. He did not look too long at the spirals. Vael's earlier warning, "Do not give it your attention," sat in Rowan's mind like a thorn. When Sable returned to the bridge after what their clocks claimed was 2 hours, her eyes were clearer, though the exhaustion still sat under them like bruises. She took one look at Rowan's posture and swore softly. "You're worse," she said. Rowan shrugged with his good shoulder, wincing. "Later," he said out of habit. Sable's mouth tightened. "Don't you later me," she snapped, and then she sighed as if the anger had been keeping her upright and she could not afford to spend it. "All right, where are we?" Rowan rotated the display toward her. The nav core had stabilized enough to show a faint line, a suggestion of route through the dead lanes toward a known corridor marker. "We might have something," Rowan said. "Not home." "But a reference point." Sable's eyes narrowed, reading the data. "What's the reference?" Rowan hesitated, then pointed. "Old Terran relay buoy markers," he said. If the archive is right, there should be one near this coordinate range. If we find it and it still has any function left, we can upload a map fragment. Routes toward fleet corridors. A real path. Sable's expression shifted, just a fraction, but Rowan saw it. Hope was dangerous, but it was also fuel, and you could see her mind reaching for it like a hand reaching for warmth. A buoy, she said, almost incredulous. Out here. Old exploration route, Rowan replied. Before the Verge got its reputation, before we got smart enough to stop poking scars. Vael watched them, silent, and Rowan wondered what the alien heard in the word hope. In Vael's doctrine, hope sounded like disorder. In Rowan-S, it sounded like breath. They began hunting the buoy. It took long hours of careful sensor sweeps, rerouted power, and patient drift. The buoy's signature was faint, almost swallowed by haze, an old chunk of metal and circuitry that had been tumbling in the Verge's outskirts for decades, maybe longer. When it finally appeared on the visual feed, it looked like a bone. A long cylindrical body with battered antenna arms, its Terran insignia half scraped away by micrometeor scars. One of its solar panels had been torn off, the other hung at an odd angle, cracked. It rotated slowly, lonely as a prayer in an empty church. There, Sable whispered, and the softness in her voice startled Rowan more than any alarm. That's ours. Rowan felt something in his chest tighten. Not joy, not yet. Joy required trust, but a kind of fierce relief, like seeing a familiar fence post in fog. Bring us alongside, he said. Sable's fingers flew across the console. The Vaelbright inched closer, thrusters pulsing in careful bursts. The buoy drifted, turning, its antenna arms like broken wings. Rowan watched for any sign of trap. Coalition sometimes seeded false beacons, but the buoy's battered Terran architecture looked honest in its decay. Honest and therefore heartbreaking. They latched onto it with a magnetic clamp, the contact jarring through the hull with a dull thud. Sable moved quickly, pulling up the buoy's interface protocols. The screen flashed error codes, then stabilized into an old Terran interface that looked almost quaint. Block letters, simple icons, designed for explorers who had not yet learned how cruel the galaxy could be. Come on, Sable murmured, as if coaxing a stubborn animal. Come on, old thing, wake up. The buoy responded with a weak spark of power. Its internal clock was nonsense, centuries off in some places, seconds off in others. Its memory storage showed corruption. But its basic function, its purpose, still lived. It was a lighthouse, and it still had a little light left. Rowan watched the upload progress bar crawl across the screen. Map fragment, Sable said, voice tight. If it has anything, if it remembers anything. Vael leaned closer, his black eyes reflecting the interface. This is your kind's trail marker, he said. Our kinds, Rowan corrected, and there was something stubborn and human in the possessive. We built these. We didn't abandon the stars entirely. The progress bar reached 90%, stalled, then jerked forward again. Rowan held his breath without realizing it. Sable's fingers hovered above the console, as if touching it might break the fragile connection. The ship's ventilation sighed. The calm static whispered. The buoy's battered casing creaked faintly as it rotated against the clamp. Then the upload completed. The nav display flickered, then resolved into something that made Rowan's throat tighten. A partial corridor map, layered with old exploration routes and, more importantly, an arrow pointing toward a region marked with Terran fleet relay buoys. Not a guarantee of the fleet's presence, but a path into broadcast range. A route with shape, with direction, with possibility. Sable let out a sound that was half laugh, half sob. She slapped the console once hard, like a woman thanking a stubborn machine the only way she knew. We're close, she whispered. Rowan stared at the route as if it might vanish if he blinked. Closer than we've been since the anomaly, he said. Vael watched their faces with that unsettling intensity, and Rowan saw something flicker in the alien's expression, not joy, not hope, but a kind of reluctant acknowledgement. Humans were dangerous not because they were strong, Vael had said, but because they did not stop. Here was proof, a wounded ship, a broken crew, still crawling toward home like a beast that refused to lie down. Sable straightened, wiping her cheek with the back of her hand as if furious at the wetness. All right, she said briskly, snapping back into engineer mode like armor. We've got a route. We've got, she paused, eyes narrowing at the sensor overlay. Rowan followed her gaze. The ghost wakes had shifted, not trailing behind them now, but sliding across their path, faint and insistent like something pacing them. The hairs on Rowan's arms rose. What is it? He asked. Sable's voice went flat. Contact, she said. Real contact. Rowan's heart dropped. The sensor overlay resolved into multiple clean signatures, disciplined, coherent, not scavenger junk. Not one ship, but a group, a cruiser with a heavy mass signature of serious armor and power, flanked by frigates moving in patient formation. Coalition, a patrol group, a net, they were between the Vaelbright and the corridor route. Rowan felt the air go colder. "They're cutting us off," he murmured, though it was obvious. The coalition ships drifted across the lane with the deliberate ease of hunters who had learned the prey's likely path. They did not broadcast yet. They did not rush. They simply positioned themselves where the route narrowed, where a wounded capital ship could not slip past without being seen. Sable's mouth tightened. "They shouldn't be here," she whispered. "Not this far out, not in dead lanes." Vael's throat lines pulsed faintly, and Rowan saw something like resignation in his posture. "They followed your scent," Vael said, "or they followed the conflict traces. Scavengers are not quiet, neither are you." Rowan's jaw clenched, the ghost wakes, the gouged wrecks, the whisper beneath static. It all felt suddenly like a long hand closing. The coalition patrol group hailed them. The comm system crackled, and for a moment Rowan feared the Halo Verge would twist the transmission into nonsense, but the voice that came through was clean, calm, and cold. It spoke in Terran standard with a slight accent, as if the coalition officer had learned the language not for diplomacy, but for precision in issuing demands. "Terran vessel," the voice said, "you are identified as TCS Vaelbright. You are outside authorized corridors. Power down all systems and prepare to be boarded. Surrender your vessel and prisoner. Compliance will be met with containment. Resistance will be met with termination." Sable's hands tightened on the console. "Containment," she spat. "That's what they call cages." Rowan said nothing. He stared at the comm panel, at the blinking receive light, and felt a slow heat rise in his chest, not anger exactly, but defiance. The coalition wanted words. Words made compliance easier. Words made the surrender feel official, inevitable, recorded. Rowan gave them silence. He reached up and cut the transmission, not with dramatic flourish, but with the quiet decisiveness of a man closing a door. The comm panel went dark. The coalition patrol group continued to drift, waiting, as if certain he would answer after he had swallowed fear. Sable turned toward him, eyes wide. "Rowan," Rowan shook his head once, and the motion sent a spike of pain through his shoulder that made his jaw clench. "No," he said, the single syllable carried weight. "We don't bargain here, we don't talk, we either slip past or we die trying." Vael watched him with those reflective black eyes. "Silence as defiance," Vael murmured. "Your species is consistent." Sable's voice tightened, fear and fury braided. "We can't slip past a cruiser and its frigates in this state," she said. "We can't outgun them. We can't outrun them. We can't." Rowan's gaze slid toward the nav display, toward the faint shimmer boundary at the edge of their mapped corridor, the verge edge, the scar, the place even coalition doctrine treated with caution. He felt the familiar cold calm settle over him, the calm that came when there were no good choices left and you had to pick the one that might still leave a story behind. "We bait them," Rowan said. Sable stared at him. "Don't," she said, and it was almost a plea. "We lure them toward the shimmer," Rowan continued, voice low. "We use their fear. We make them decide between letting us go or following into the wound." Sable's face tightened into a mask of anger. "The ship cannot take another transit," she snapped. "It barely took the last one. The stabilizer is held together by your optimism and my burned skin. If we go in deep—" "If we don't," Rowan said quietly, "we surrender. And I don't believe surrender means survival. Not for us, not for you. Not for me, not even for him." He nodded toward Vael without looking. Vael's throat lines pulsed faintly. "They will not kill me," Vael said. "They will return me, as asset or as example." Rowan looked at him then, and the pain in his shoulder made his vision pulse. "And what do you want?" Rowan asked. Vael hesitated. The pause was small but telling. "I want to remain alive," Vael said finally, as if forcing the words through doctrine. Rowan's smile was thin. "Then you come with us," he said. "Because alone, out here, you won't." Sable's hands shook slightly, though she tried to hide it by gripping the console harder. "Rowan," she said, voice raw, "if the wound did take the crew, what makes you think it won't take us?" Rowan swallowed. He could still see Captain Merrick's ghost on the bridge, could still hear her voice sometimes in the comm static like a knife turning. He did not know the answer. He only knew that the coalition cruiser was real and close and patient. "Because it has yet," Rowan said. "Because the wound hasn't finished whatever story it wants with us, and because I'd rather gamble with madness than accept a cage." Sable closed her eyes for a moment. When she opened them, they were bright and wet and furious. "You're going to get me killed," she whispered. Rowan felt guilt flare, sharp and immediate, but he did not let it change his voice. I'm going to try to get you home, he said. Vael's throat lines dimmed. Home, he murmured again, and the words sounded different now, less like mockery, more like a concept he could not comfortably dismiss. Rowan set the ship into motion, pushing the thrusters harder than he liked. The Vaelbright shuddered, protesting. The engines groaned like a wounded giant. On the sensor overlay, the Coalition patrol group responded immediately, formation tightening, the cruiser adjusting course with cold precision. They did not rush into a chase like scavengers. They simply moved to match to close to herd. The dead lanes narrowed. The haze thickened. The shimmer boundary ahead grew more visible on the viewport, not as a bright line but as a subtle distortion, as if the universe there was slightly out of focus. Rowan's skin prickled. The calm static deepened. The whisper stirred beneath it, faint and patient, as if anticipating the approach. The Coalition hailed them again. Terran vessel, the calm voice said, your silence is recorded as refusal. Power down. You will be boarded. Rowan did not respond. He kept his eyes on the nav display and the shimmer ahead. He cut comm again without answering. Silence was a blade. He wielded it with steadiness. The cruiser began firing. The first shot was not meant to kill. It was a warning, a kinetic pulse that struck the space near the Vaelbright's bow and detonated in a bloom of shrapnel, a cloud of bright fragments that rang against their armor like hail. The ship shook. Alarms flared. Rowan's injured shoulder screamed as he gripped the console. Sable's voice came tight. They're ranging us. Rowan's jaw clenched. They're telling us they can end it whenever they want, he said. Vael stood very still, eyes fixed on the sensor overlay. The cruiser will not risk deep verge, Vael said, but his voice lacked the earlier certainty. He stopped, throat lines pulsing. They should not. Rowan felt the shimmer ahead grow nearer. The Vaelbright's engines strained. The ship's systems flickered, the foreign alphabet patterns pulsing faster. The wound was close, and the ship seemed to know it, like an animal sensing a cliff edge. The cruiser fired again, this time with intent. A beam, cold, precise, lanced toward them, striking the Vaelbright's dorsal ridge with a violent flash. The impact was like a fist. The ship bucked. Rowan was thrown forward, his chest slamming into the console edge. Pain flared in his ribs. The world went white for a moment, then returned in strobing emergency light. He tasted blood. Sable screamed over comm. Deck 9, she shouted. They hit Deck 9, structural. The words cut off as comm static surged, the whisper beneath it swelling like breath drawn in. Rowan's heart hammered. He forced himself to sit upright, blinking hard. The nav display flickered, then steadied. The shimmer boundary loomed close now, a wall of warped focus in the haze. Hold on, Rowan muttered to the ship, to Sable, to himself. Hold on. He pushed them into the shimmer. The transition was not like before. The first Verge Edge transit had been brutal, but it had still felt like crossing a boundary line. This was like stepping into a storm that had been waiting with hunger. The moment the ship entered, reality tore at them like wind tearing cloth. Gravity flipped hard enough that Rowan's stomach lurched as if it were trying to exit through his throat. The bridge lights strobed. Consoles sparked. The comm static became a roar, and the whisper beneath it rose into something that could no longer be dismissed as suggestion. Voices filled the bridge, not hallucination thin, not distant. Voices close, layered, intimate. Rowan heard Captain Merrick's voice at his shoulder, calm and sharp. Kepler, she said, and the sound made his throat constrict. You always did choose the cliff. Rowan's vision blurred. He turned, half expecting to see her, and for a heartbeat he did. Her outline by the captain's chair, hair loose, eyes hard with command. Her hand rested on the broken armrest as if it were not broken. Then the figure fractured into static, as if the wound had laughed and pulled it apart. Sable's voice came over comm, screaming, but beneath her scream Rowan heard other voices, crew voices, calling, pleading, laughing, singing all at once. Chief, someone shouted. Sable. Another voice, familiar, warm, said, tell my kid I, and then dissolved into noise. Sable's scream broke into sobbing that sounded like a person drowning in sound. Vael made a sound Rowan had never heard from him before, a low, involuntary hiss of fear. The alien's throat lines flared bright, patterns racing like fire through dry grass. Vael's eyes were wide, reflecting the strobing lights, and his posture, always controlled, had tightened into something like defensive coil. What do you hear? Rowan shouted, not sure if his voice was actually leaving his mouth or only existing in his skull. Vael's answer came ragged. It is here, Vael said, and the words were not about the ship. It is in the fold. It is, he swallowed hard. It speaks. Rowan's hands slammed onto the console as the ship lurched again. The inertial dampeners screamed and failed. The deck became wall became ceiling. The world spun. Rowan's injured shoulder tore with pain as he clung. He felt the ship's bones groan, metal flexing in ways it should not, bulkheads remembering different shapes and trying to become them. Then the wound spoke. Not in calm static, not as whisper, as presence, as certainty pressed into the mind. The words were not heard so much as understood, stamped into thought like a brand. Return is not free. The phrase landed with the weight of a verdict. Rowan's breath caught. Sable's sobbing over calm went abruptly silent for a heartbeat, as if even she had been stunned into stillness by the voice. Vael's throat lines dimmed suddenly, like a flame smothered, and his eyes turned toward the viewport where nothing could be seen but warped haze and sliding luminous threads. Return is not free. Rowan clenched his teeth, rage flaring through fear. "We're paying," he whispered, though he did not know if he was speaking aloud. "We're paying in blood already." The wound did not answer with words, but the ship lurched again, and the voices rose, and Rowan felt the meaning. Payment would be taken whether offered or not. Behind them, the Coalition patrol group entered the shimmer. Rowan saw it on the sensor overlay in fragments, signatures flickering, warping, stretching into impossible angles. The frigates, clean lines, became smeared, like ink dropped into water. Their formation broke as the wound's currents pulled at them. One frigate's signature spiked, then splintered into multiple readings, as if the ship had become several ships occupying slightly different moments. Another frigate vanished entirely from sensors, not destroyed by explosion but erased, like a word struck from a page. The cruiser held longer. Its mass signature remained coherent, stubborn, heavy with armor and doctrine. It pushed into the fold like a fist, as if believing force could make order where order did not belong. Rowan felt a bitter admiration for that stubbornness even as he hated it. The Coalition was a machine. Machines did not fear storms, they calculated them. But the Halo Verge was not weather. It was scar tissue, and scar tissue did not obey. The cruiser fired inside the fold. The shot was imperfect, warped by distortion, but it still struck. Rowan felt the impact not as sound, but as a deep vibration through the ship's bones. Alarms screamed. The bridge lights died entirely for a heartbeat, plunging them into darklit only by the faint glow of Vael's throat lines, which flared again in panic patterns. Then emergency lights returned in harsh red, making everything look like blood. "Deck 9. Sable's voice came back over calm, strained, and broken. Rowan, the deck's coming down." Rowan's heart hammered. He shoved himself out of the captain's chair, pain screaming through his shoulder, and staggered toward the bridge hatch. "Sable," he shouted. "Where are you?" "Engineering access," she gasped. "I went to reinforce the struts, Rowan, it's..." Her words cut off in a sound like metal tearing. Rowan's mind went cold. "Vael," he snapped, turning. "With me?" Vael hesitated for a heartbeat, eyes wide, throat lines pulsing. In that heartbeat, Rowan saw Vael's fear fully naked. This place was not simply dangerous to the alien, it was heresy. It was disorder made flesh. Vael's doctrine had no category for wounds that spoke. Then Vael moved, following, long strides matching Rowan's desperate pace. The corridors between bridge and deck 9 were a nightmare. Gravity flickered in sick jerks, making each step a stumble. Emergency lights strobed red, casting shadows that seemed to move with intent. The calm static roared in Rowan's ear, and beneath it voices whispered, not always intelligible, but always familiar enough to hurt. Rowan heard his own name spoken in Captain Merrick's cadence. He heard laughter. He heard someone sobbing quietly behind a wall. He forced himself not to turn his head too quickly, because turning felt like giving attention, and Vael's warning, "Do not stare, do not give it your attention," echoed in his mind like a bell. They reached Deck 9's main support corridor and found chaos made physical. A structural strut had failed under the cruiser's warped strike, and the deck plating had buckled. A section of overhead support had collapsed, pinning a tangle of conduit and metal beam against the floor. Steam hissed from ruptured coolant lines. The air was hot and metallic, tasting of burnt insulation. Sable lay beneath the support strut. She was not crushed entirely. If she had been, there would have been no time for anything but grief. But the heavy beam had pinned her lower body, trapping her legs under bent metal. Her face was pale, slick with sweat, smeared with soot. Her eyes were wide, bright with pain. She saw Rowan and tried to grin, the expression sharp and brittle. "Told you," she gasped. "You'd get me killed." Rowan dropped to his knees beside her, careful not to jostle the beam. "Shut up," he said, and his voice shook with something close to panic. He grabbed the beam with his good hand and then, without thinking, grabbed with the injured one too, and pain tore through his shoulder like fire. His muscles failed. The beam did not move. It might as well have been the ship itself pressing down. Rowan's breath came ragged. I can lift it, he lied, and his arms trembled. Sable's mouth twisted. No, you can't, she gasped. Not with that arm. She swallowed hard, eyes squeezed shut for a moment as pain rolled through her. When she opened them again, they were furious. Don't waste time being brave, be useful, get leverage. Rowan looked around wildly. The corridor was littered with debris, shattered paneling, loose cables sparking. He saw a broken support pipe, thick and heavy, and dragged it toward the beam to use as a lever. He jammed it under the beam's edge, braced it against the floor, and pushed down with his weight. The pipe bent slightly. The beam shifted maybe a centimeter, maybe less, but it was something. Sable screamed, raw and involuntary, as the movement tore pain through her trapped legs. Rowan froze, horror flashing. Sable, do it, she snarled through clenched teeth. Do it or leave me, but don't hesitate like a coward. Rowan's eyes stung. He shoved down again, putting everything into it. His injured shoulder screamed. His ribs burned. The beam shifted another fraction, but not enough. Not nearly enough. He felt the uselessness of his own strength like a humiliation. Commanders were supposed to lift ships with orders, but orders did not move metal. Orders did not free legs pinned under a collapsed strut. He was just a man with one good arm and one burning one, kneeling in a corridor while the universe demanded payment. Vael stood a few steps back, watching. Rowan turned his head sharply. Vael, he snapped. Help! Vael did not move immediately. His black eyes flicked from Rowan to Sable to the beam. His throat lines pulsed fast, bright, then dimmed, then bright again, like his body was arguing with itself. In that hesitation, Rowan saw the choice forming in him, clear as any weapon. Help the humans, enemies, and bind himself to them more deeply than observation allowed, or refuse and remain pure to his doctrine, even if purity meant dying alone in a haunted ship. Sable's breath came in ragged gasps. Vael, she said, and her voice was rough with pain but still edged with the insolence that made her Sable Ilyan. If you're going to watch this. Vael's throat lines flickered. His gaze slid toward the corridor shadows, toward the strobing lights, as if he could feel the wound pressing against the ship. If I help you, Vael said quietly, and Rowan heard strain in his voice, I cannot claim neutrality. Rowan's jaw clenched. Neutrality is a luxury, he said. Pick a side or the Verge will pick for you. Vael's eyes narrowed. For a heartbeat, Rowan thought the alien might turn and walk away, leaving them to die because doctrine was a spine and spines did not bend. Then Vael stepped forward. He moved to the beam with slow, deliberate grace, as if approaching a ritual altar. He placed both hands on the metal, fingers splayed. His throat lines dimmed to a steady glow, like embers settling. He did not grunt. He did not announce effort. He simply lifted. The beam rose, not easily, not like a miracle. Rowan saw Vael's muscles tense under slate skin, saw the tendons in his forearms stand out, saw the bioluminescent lines flare brighter with strain. But the beam rose, inch by inch, and Rowan's breath caught in something like disbelief. The alien held it high enough for Rowan to jam the lever deeper, to wedge a piece of shattered paneling under it for support. Now! Vael hissed through clenched teeth, and there was raw urgency in the command. Rowan scrambled, ignoring the screaming protest of his shoulder. He grabbed Sable under her arms, careful not to jostle her too roughly, and pulled. Sable screamed again, the sound turning into a sob she bit down on. Her legs were stuck, he could feel the resistance. He pulled harder, his good arm straining, his injured arm useless now, hanging like dead weight. Come on, he gasped. Come on, Sable. Sable's hands clawed at the deck, trying to help, but her fingers slipped on oil and soot. Rowan, she rasped, voice breaking, if you tear them. I don't care, Rowan said, and the words were half lie, half desperate truth. I don't care what it costs. Vael's arms trembled. The beam shuddered. The wedge held barely. Rowan pulled again, and this time Sable slid free with a horrible sucking sound of metal releasing flesh. She collapsed against him, limp for a heartbeat. Rowan nearly fell backward with her weight, but he caught himself and dragged her away from the beam's shadow. Vael released the beam abruptly, staggering back as it slammed down onto the wedge with a violent clang. The paneling cracked. The beam settled lower but did not crush again. Vael leaned against the bulkhead, chest heaving in a way Rowan had never seen from him. Vael's throat lines pulsed bright, then dimmed like a heart racing. Rowan looked down at Sable. Her legs were wrong. The armor plating on her lower limbs was crumpled. Blood seeped from beneath it in dark, slow streams. Her boots were bent at angles that made Rowan's stomach revolt. She was conscious, barely, her face pale, lips trembling. Her eyes found Rowan S., and in them he saw pain so deep it was almost calm. Don't, she whispered, and Rowan realized she was reading his face, reading the panic and grief. Don't look at it like that. Rowan swallowed hard. Medbay, he said, voice hoarse. We get you to Medbay. Sable's mouth twitched. Yeah, she whispered. Sure, let's go to Medbay, let's fix. Her voice broke into a strangled laugh that turned into a hiss of pain. Let's fix everything. Rowan scooped her up as carefully as he could, cradling her upper body while trying not to jostle her legs. His injured shoulder screamed. He bit down hard, tasting blood. Vael moved beside him, silent, watching with those black reflective eyes that now held something different, something unsettled. The ship shook again, a deep vibration, and Rowan knew the battle was still happening somewhere behind them in the fold. The Coalition cruiser was still firing, still trying to impose order on a wound. The wound was still taking payment. They reached Medbay in a nightmare drift of flickering gravity and strobing lights. The corridors seemed longer than they should have been. Twice Rowan found himself turning a corner and seeing the same bulkhead marking again, as if the ship's layout had looped. Each time, Vael placed a hand on Rowan's shoulder, careful, light, and guided him in a slightly different direction, as if the alien could sense the ship's wrong bends. Rowan did not ask how. He did not have breath to spare for questions. Medbay's doors were sealed, but Rowan forced them open with the emergency override. The room inside was cold, too clean, still bearing the eerie, untouched perfection of their earlier search. Autodock stations sat idle, screens dark. The trauma beds were pristine. The sight of it now felt obscene, like a feast laid out in a famine. Rowan laid Sable on the nearest bed and activated the autodock with shaking hands. The machine whirred, lights flickering as it struggled to draw enough power. It extended a scanner arm over Sable's legs. The scanner's light swept down. Sable hissed, eyes squeezed shut. Rowan stood at her side, gripping the bed rail so hard his knuckles hurt, watching the autodock display populate with cold clinical information. Multiple fractures, crush injury, severe tissue damage, nerve compromise, possible spinal trauma. Rowan's stomach churned. No, he whispered, as if refusing the words could change them. The autodock recommended amputation as a potential long-term solution. It recommended sedation. It recommended evacuation to full surgical facility, an impossible phrase in the Halo Verge. Sable opened her eyes and looked at the display. She let out a breath that was almost a laugh. Well, she whispered, voice thin, that's inconvenient. Rowan's throat tightened. Sable, he said, and his voice broke. He cleared his throat, tried again. I'm sorry. Sable's eyes flicked to him, sharp even through pain. Don't, she said again, and now there was anger in it. Don't you start that. Don't you start carrying guilt like it's a medal. Rowan's hands trembled. I chose the shimmer, he whispered. I chose the bait. You chose not to die in a cage, Sable snapped, and then she gasped as pain rolled through her, face twisting. When it passed, she exhaled slowly, voice softer but still edged. Rowan, listen. The universe already took the crew. If you let it take your spine too, then it wins for free. Rowan stared at her, eyes stinging. Return isn't free, he murmured, and the words tasted like ash now, stamped into his mind. Sable's mouth twitched. Yeah, she whispered. No kidding. Vael stood near the doorway, silent. The medbay's dim lights reflected off his eyes, making him look like a statue carved from night. Rowan turned his head toward him, anger and gratitude tangled in his chest like barbed wire. You saved her, Rowan said, the words rough. Why? Vael's throat lines pulsed faintly. He did not look away. 'Cause you would have died trying, Vael said, and then I would have been alone. He paused, and something in his face tightened. And because your engineer does not surrender, it is unsettling. Sable coughed a laugh that turned into a hiss. Unsettling, she echoed. Good, get used to it. Rowan turned back to the autodock display, forcing himself into practicality because practicality was the only way not to drown. We need to stabilize her, he said, voice steadier now. We need to stop bleeding. We need, the autodock beeped, offering a list of options: pain management, splinting, clotting foam. Rowan selected what he could. The machine injected a sedative into Sable's arm, and her eyes fluttered, fighting it. She hated losing control even to medicine. Rowan held her hand with his good one, and her grip was fierce despite everything. Rowan, she whispered, voice fading as sedation pulled her down. Promise me something. Rowan swallowed hard. Anything. Sable's eyes focused on his with intense clarity. Finish it, she whispered. Get us back. Don't stop because I'm broken. Don't make my legs the reason you give up. Rowan's throat tightened. He leaned closer. I won't, he whispered. I swear. Sable's mouth twitched, a faint, grim smile. Good, she murmured, because I didn't break my spine so you could write a sad log entry. Then her eyes closed and her grip loosened as sedation took her. Rowan sat back, breathing hard, feeling the weight of his promise settle over him like armor and chain both. Outside medbay, the ship shook again, harder this time, a deep, violent shudder that rattled cabinets and made the autodock's lights flicker. Rowan's head snapped up. He felt the calm static surge, the whisper beneath it rising like breath drawn in before speech. Return is not free. The voice seemed to press again, not as clear words this time, but as a meaning that thrummed through the ship's bones. Rowan pushed himself off the medbay chair, pain flaring in his shoulder. "Bridge," he said, voice tight. "We need to know what's happening." Vael stepped away from the doorway without being told. He moved with that controlled urgency that made Rowan's skin prickle. Together they left medbay, sealing the door behind them to keep the room stable and quiet for Sable. Rowan felt like he was leaving a piece of himself behind with her, but he did not allow himself to stop. Stopping was surrender. The route back to the bridge was worse now. The ship's layout seemed to shift under their feet. Corridors that should have been straight bent slightly or forked where no fork existed. Lights strobed. Voices whispered from vents. Rowan heard Captain Merrick's voice again, closer, as if she were walking just behind his shoulder. "Kepler," she murmured. "Don't look back." He kept his eyes forward, sweat cold on his skin, jaw clenched so hard his teeth ached. On the bridge, the sensor overlay was chaos. The Coalition patrol group was still partially visible, but their signatures were broken, smeared, fragmented by the fold. 2 frigate signatures had vanished entirely, gone, not destroyed in a fireball, simply erased. Another flickered in and out as if half the ship existed in a different moment. The cruiser's signature remained, but it was warped, its mass signature spiking in unnatural ways as if the ship were being stretched. Its weapons' fire registered as imperfect pulses, bending, scattering. It was a beast thrashing in a net of scar tissue. The Vailbright's own systems were failing. Warning lights flashed in the foreign alphabet patterns again. Power output dipped. The stabilizer readings spiked, then dropped, then spiked again. The ship was being torn at the seams by this deep transit. They were surviving not because they were safe, but because the wound had not decided to finish them yet. Rowan grabbed the console with his good hand, forcing himself into the role that kept them alive. Command as action. "We need out," he said. "We need to emerge." Vail's eyes were fixed on the viewport, where the haze was no longer mere haze but a luminous storm of threads sliding past, like veins of a living thing. His throat lines pulsed faintly. "The fold is tightening," Vael said quietly. "It is reacting. It does not like your pursuers." Rowan's mouth went dry. "It doesn't like anyone," he muttered. Vail's gaze flicked toward him. "Perhaps," Vael said, and the word held fear, "but it may have preferences." Rowan didn't know what to do with that. He focused on the nav display, on the faint corridor route toward the relay buoy markers. If they could emerge on the far side of the fold, they would be closer, within range, perhaps, of the fleet's relay network. But emerging required the ship to hold together a little longer. It required the stabilizers not to give out entirely. It required the universe to allow them to choose an exit. The wound, as if hearing his thought, pressed again. Not words this time, but sensation. A tightening, a pressure behind the eyes, a sense of being watched from inside one's own skull. Rowan's vision blurred at the edges. For a heartbeat, he saw the bridge not as it was now, empty and dim, but as it had been, crew at stations, Captain Merrick in her chair, voices calling status reports. Then that vision folded inward, collapsing, leaving only the empty chair again, broken armrest gleaming in emergency light. Rowan swallowed hard and forced his fingers to move, to manipulate the nav core, to follow the corridor path as best as he could. He adjusted thrust, minimal but deliberate, trying to steer through luminous threads that might as well have been currents. The ship shuddered under him like a wounded beast trying not to panic. The cruiser fired again. The shot came warped by the fold, but it still struck the Vailbright's aft section, somewhere near the engine ring. The impact was like being kicked by a god. The bridge console sparked. Rowan was thrown sideways, his injured shoulder slamming into the captain's chair armrest. Pain exploded so bright he saw stars. He bit back a scream, tasting blood where he bit his tongue. The ship's power dipped sharply. Lights went out. For a moment the bridge was lit only by Vail's bioluminescent lines and the faint glow of error codes on the display wall. Then emergency power surged back, weak and flickering. Rowan panted, vision swimming. He forced himself upright, one hand shaking. His shoulder felt like it had been ripped apart. He blinked hard, ignoring the urge to vomit, and looked at the sensor overlay. The cruiser's signature spiked, then fractured. For a heartbeat, it looked as if the ship were splitting into several images, like reflections in broken glass. The mass signature stretched, bent. Then a portion of it vanished, gone, erased, leaving behind a smear of residual energy that made the sensor overlay flare. The remaining portion flickered, struggling to stay coherent. Vael made a sound, low and involuntary, like awe mixed with horror. "It is consuming them," Vael whispered. Rowan's breath caught. The wound was taking payment, and it was taking it from the Coalition now, as if offended by their insistence on control. The cruiser's remaining signature began to retreat, pulling back toward the edge of the fold where reality steadied. Its frigate escorts, what was left of them, followed in broken formation, no longer hunters, now survivors. Rowan saw their chance like a crack in a door. "Out," he rasped. "We go out now." He shoved thrust through the remaining functional systems, not enough to flare brightly, but enough to push them toward the fold's thinning edge. The ship groaned. The stabilizer readings screamed. Warning lights flashed in that foreign alphabet. The comm static roared, voices layered, the whisper pressing like breath. "Return is not free." Rowan clenched his jaw. "We've paid," he whispered, though he did not know if he was speaking to the wound or to himself. "We've paid enough." The fold loosened suddenly like a fist opening. Gravity lurched, flipped halfway, then settled into uneasy normal. The luminous threads thinned. The haze returned to mere particulate drift. The sensor overlay steadied. The comm static dropped back into its usual hiss, with the whisper beneath it faint again, satisfied. They emerged. The stars beyond were clearer now, less warped, their spectral signatures aligning more closely with the buoy's map fragment. The nav display resolved into a corridor path that made Rowan's throat tighten, a route leading toward the region where Terran relay buoys formed a mesh. Not home yet, not safe, but within reach. Within range, if they could keep the ship moving. If the ship could stay afloat in the simplest, most brutal sense. Behind them, the Coalition cruiser emerged too, or what remained of it. It came out of the fold, trailing flickering energy like smoke. Its formation was gone. Its signatures were unstable. It did not fire again. It turned away, limping, as if the wound had bitten a piece out of its doctrine, and it wanted nothing more than distance. The frigates that remained scattered like startled birds, fleeing the scar. Rowan stared at the retreating enemy and felt a bleak triumph rise in him, not joy but vindication. The Coalition had thought to cage them. The wound had reminded them that some places did not accept cages, but the Vaelbright was barely alive. The engine ring status was critical. Power output was down. Life support flickered. The stabilizer readings were redlined. The ship's hull integrity showed new fractures. Somewhere in the aft compartments, alarms wailed muffled through bulkheads. The Vaelbright breathed in ragged gulps. Rowan's hands trembled as he forced himself to take in the data. The promise he had made to Sable in medbay sat in his chest like a stone. "Finish it. Get us back. Don't stop." Vael stood beside him, silent, and Rowan could feel the alien's presence differently now. Vael had lifted the beam. Vael had chosen. It did not make Vael human. It did not make Vael friend. But it made Vael something other than mere prisoner. Rowan swallowed, pain pulsing in his shoulder like a slow drum. He looked at the nav display, at the corridor route toward relay range, and he felt the cold reality of it. The hardest part was not the fights, not the fold, not even the wounds that spoke. The hardest part would be the long burn between here and home, the stretch where you had to keep going when everything in you wanted to lie down. He opened the ship log, because he could not help himself, because writing was his thin fence against chaos. His voice came hoarse but steady as he spoke into the recorder. "Ship log," he said. "We located and accessed Terran relay buoy, acquired partial corridor map toward fleet relay mesh. Coalition intercept group engaged. We initiated deep verge transit. The fold responded. Enemy losses severe. We emerged with ship critically damaged. Chief Mechanist Ilyan injured." His voice caught. He forced it through. "Severely. She is stabilized. We are within potential broadcast range if we can maintain propulsion. We will continue." He stopped recording and sat back, breathing hard, the bridge spinning slightly around him. The comm static whispered faintly beneath the hum, and Rowan felt the presence of the wound like a shadow behind the ship, listening, patient, not finished. Vael spoke quietly, almost unwilling. "Your engineer will not walk again," Vael said. It was not cruelty. It was statement like naming weather. Rowan's jaw clenched. He stared at the nav display until it blurred. "Then she'll fly," he said, and the words came out like iron. "And if she can't fly, then she'll still get home. I promised." Vael's throat lines pulsed faintly. "Promises," Vael murmured. "You bind yourselves with them?" Rowan looked at him, eyes burning. We bind ourselves to each other, Rowan said. That's the difference between us and the coalition. They bind themselves to order. We bind ourselves to people, and we don't stop because it hurts. Vael held his gaze for a long moment. In the dim emergency light, his eyes looked less like cold water and more like mirrors reflecting something he did not like seeing. He said nothing, but his silence felt different now, less disdain, more weight. Rowan turned back to the ship, to the route, to the long corridor ahead. He could feel blood drying under his bandage, could feel his shoulder swelling, could feel exhaustion pulling at his mind like gravity. He thought of Sable lying sedated in medbay, legs crushed, spine compromised, still more furious at pity than at pain. He thought of the missing crew, of the closet shrine, of the half-eaten meal, of Captain Merrick's ghost voice calling his name. He thought of the wound's verdict. Return is not free. Rowan's mouth twisted into something that might have been a smile if there were any humor left in him. All right, he whispered to the dark beyond the viewport, to the bruise-colored haze, to the listening scar in space. We'll pay, but we're coming home. The Vaelbright limped onward, engines groaning, systems flickering, carrying 3 stubborn lives and a promise that weighed more than any armor. Behind them, the Halo Verge settled back into its patient drift, voices whispering beneath static, threads of luminous haze sliding like veins. The wound had spoken. The wound had taken. The wound had tasted the blood of those who tried to cage, and for now it had let the caged slip through. For now. And the long burn toward home began. The ship began to die the way tired animals die, not in a grand collapse but in small betrayals, each one forgivable until the sum of them became a verdict. The auxiliary reactor had been a stubborn lantern for days, burning on improvisation and the faith of a woman who could make a wrench into scripture, but now its pulse grew uneven. The Vaelbright's lights dimmed into a sickly amber and then brightened again with a shiver, as if the ship were trying to convince itself it still had strength. The ventilation, once a ragged breath, became a series of shallow sips. Somewhere in the ductwork, a fan blade began to tick against a warped housing, the sound soft and maddeningly regular, like a clock insisting on time even as time refused to behave. Rowan sat on the bridge with his injured shoulder strapped tight, the brace biting into his skin, and watched the readouts like a man watching the face of a loved one in fever, searching for signs of improvement and finding only the slow drift toward worse. Sable lay in medbay where the autodoc did what it could and no more. The machine kept her stable, kept her pain dulled, kept her blood from running away, but it could not restore what had been crushed. It could not give her back legs that answered her will. It could not give her back the simple, unspoken future of walking a corridor and cursing at a stuck panel. When Rowan checked on her, she was either asleep under sedation or awake with eyes too bright, her jaw set with the same fury she used to face failing systems. She had demanded the sedative be lowered enough that she could think. The autodoc had protested, and Rowan had overridden it. She had looked at him then with that familiar sharpness and said, "Don't you dare turn me into cargo." And he, whose shoulder throbbed and whose ribs still felt bruised from impacts, had nodded as if he were taking an engineering report instead of a prayer. Vael moved through the ship with quiet purpose now, no longer merely a presence at the edge of the bridge, but a third strand in their frayed rope. He did not touch the Terran systems unless asked, and even then his hands hovered like a man handling someone else's sacred objects. Yet his knowledge slipped into their gaps the way water finds cracks. When Rowan's nav began to stutter again, Vael offered a recalibration method that compensated for the Halo Verge's shifting spectral distortions. When the sensor array spat ghost wakes that threatened to confuse their thin margin of awareness, Vael showed Rowan how to filter for the subtle signature of something truly pursuing rather than the wound's mimicry. He spoke less of doctrine and more of survival, and that alone was evidence of change. The Keth did not like to admit that survival could be a reason rather than a rule. He remained physically unbroken, his movements smooth, his breath steady, his slate skin unmarred, but the careful composure he wore like armor had been dented. Sometimes Rowan caught him staring at bulkheads as if they might speak again, his throat lines faintly pulsing with a rhythm that looked uncomfortably like listening. They were close enough now that the map fragment from the relay buoy made sense. The corridor ahead, though still threaded with haze and old debris, was less warped. The stars held their positions longer. The ship's chronometers argued less violently, though they still quarreled in small ways that made Rowan distrust every number. The fleet relay mesh should have been within reach if the Vaelbright could keep her engines sputtering for a few more hours. But that was the problem. Sputtering was not sprinting, and the final stretch demanded a sprint. The corridor did not care what you deserved. It cared what you could do. The auxiliary reactor warning climbed into a red band and stayed there, like a sunset that did not end. Sable had patched its coolant lines twice, rerouted flow, sacrificed non-essential systems, until the ship's interior felt like a half-abandoned church lit by candles. Now there were no more sacrifices left that wouldn't kill them. If the reactor failed, it would drag the rest of their crippled power grid with it like a drowning man grabbing ankles. The engines, already strained, would go silent. The Vaelbright would become a drifting monument in a lane that smelled of conflict and warp residue and the wound's attention. Rowan sat alone on the bridge for a long stretch while Sable dozed fitfully and Vael monitored sensor filters in the background. Rowan's logs had become longer in these last hours, not because he had more information, but because he had fewer illusions. He wrote with his left hand when his right trembled too much. He wrote about the buoy, about the coalition patrol group that had broken in the fold, about Sable's injury in clinical words, because clinical words were easier to bear than grief-shaped ones. And in the spaces between sentences, he found himself writing the same phrase again and again in his head. Return is not free, return is not free, return is not free. It was a warning, and it was also a bargain. The wound had spoken, but it had not finished. The moment the auxiliary reactor finally began to fail was almost gentle. A low vibration deep in the ship's belly shifted in pitch, and the lights dimmed as if someone had placed a hand over them. Then the main display wall on the bridge flickered, error codes crawling like insects, and the engine's output dropped by a percentage that made Rowan's stomach tight. The ship's breath caught, ventilation slowed, then resumed with a wheeze. Rowan stared at the power readout and felt that cold calm again, the calm that came when the last few moves were all that mattered. "Sable," he said into the calm, keeping his voice steady. "We're losing the aux." Her reply came hoarse, slower than it would have a day ago. "I know," she said, and he could hear the strain of her waking, the way pain made even breath an effort. "I can feel it in the deck. Give me," she stopped, and when she spoke again there was a bitter humor in it. "Give me legs, Rowan, I could fix it if I had legs." Rowan swallowed hard. "Tell me what you need," he said instead, because he could not give her legs. Sable exhaled. "There's a bypass I never finished because I thought we'd be dead before it mattered," she said. It's on Deck 7 junction." "But it's a crawl space job. You'll have to," she paused, and Rowan heard her pride fighting her reality. "Vael will have to, he's steadier, he's not half-rotten in the shoulder." Rowan's jaw clenched. He looked at Vael, who had gone still at the mention of his name. "Vael," Rowan said. Vael met his gaze. His throat lines pulsed faintly. "I will go," Vael said, and there was no mockery in it. "Tell me where." Rowan relayed the location. Vael moved without hesitation now, slipping out of the bridge with silent speed, and Rowan felt the oddness of it like a stone in his mouth. An enemy walking willingly into Terran crawlspaces to keep a Terran ship alive. The galaxy had not prepared either of them for this kind of alliance. The galaxy, Rowan suspected, didn't prepare anyone for what happened when the usual fences became irrelevant. Minutes passed with the slow cruelty of time that knew it was being watched. The power readout dipped again, and the bridge lights flickered. Rowan's heart hammered. He thought of the fleet, somewhere ahead, fighting the war that had already chewed up so much of humanity's blood. He thought of the declaration that the Vaelbright was lost, that her name had likely already been folded into casualty lists and memorial speeches. He thought of Sable's mandate, finish the return, and felt the weight of it press him into a single decision. They could keep trying to crawl, conserving power, praying the aux would hold long enough to reach broadcast range naturally. Or they could do what commanders did when prayers failed, make noise. Broadcasting was dangerous. Broadcasting was a flare in night. It would announce them not only to the fleet, but to anything hungry within the corridor's edges. Scavengers, stragglers, patrols, the opportunists that lived off war's debris. The dead lanes had taught them that conflict traces had sent. A distress identity burst would be a feast bell. Rowan sat in the broken captain's chair and stared at the comm panel. His hand hovered over the control. He felt the phantom memory of Captain Merrick behind him, that calm voice that had once said, in another life, that sometimes you chose between dying unseen and dying loud. The wound's whisper stirred beneath the static, faint but present, like breath waiting to become speech. Rowan's shoulder throbbed, the brace bit. He keyed the comm to medbay. "Sable," he said, "we're not going to make it at this rate." There was a pause, and then Sable's voice came in quiet, stripped of humor. "I know," she said. I'm going to flare, Rowan said, another pause longer. He could almost hear her mind weighing risks the way she weighed coolant flow and stress limits. If you flare, she said, everything comes. I know, Rowan replied. Sable exhaled slowly, and for a moment her voice sounded very young. Then do it, she said. Do it clean, make it count. Rowan looked at the comm panel, then at the nav display showing the faint corridor route, then at the sensor overlay where ghost wakes drifted like pale fish. He thought of their missing crew, their absence like a hollow limb. He thought of the wound's verdict. He thought of the hearth ahead, fleet voices, human noise, the stubborn warmth of other people. He pressed the control. The Vael transmitted a Terran distress identity burst. It was not a gentle call. It was a coded flare, an old exploration protocol meant to cut through interference and be recognized even by a ship half-deaf and half-dead. It carried the Vaelbright's registry, her class, her last known fleet association. It carried Rowan's voice recorded in a compressed packet, short, steady, stripped of anything but fact. This is Commander Rowan Kepler of the Terran capital ship TCS Vaelbright. Warp anomaly separation. Survivors aboard. Critical systems failing. Request immediate retrieval. Repeat, request immediate retrieval. The moment the burst went out, the comm static surged like a wave. The ship's lights flickered, the auxiliary reactor whined, offended by the power draw, and the readout dipped sharply. Rowan felt his stomach drop. He had gambled with their last fuel. He had lit a fire in a corridor full of dry brush. For a heartbeat, nothing answered. Rowan sat very still, listening, as if his attention could reach across space. The wound's whisper stirred beneath the static, and he felt a cold sweat break along his spine. Then, faint at first, a response crackled through, Terran signal modulation, filtered through relay mesh. The voice that came was startled, almost disbelieving, as if the speaker had heard a ghost call their name. Say again, transmitting vessel, the voice demanded. Identify. Rowan swallowed hard and keyed the transmitter again, forcing his voice steady. Terran Fleet Relay, this is Commander Rowan Kepler of the TCS Vaelbright, he repeated. We are alive. We are in the Halo Verge outer lattice corridor. We are... His voice caught for a fraction of a second because saying alive out loud made the loss sharper. He forced it through. We are critical. Request immediate retrieval. The comm line went quiet for a heartbeat, as if the entire relay mesh had held its breath. Then another voice came on, older, with the calm authority of someone who had learned to sound unshaken in war. Commander Kepler, it said, and Rowan felt his throat tighten because the voice carried, beneath its control, a crack of emotion. You were declared lost. Rowan closed his eyes for a brief moment, pain and relief mixing like poison and medicine. We didn't agree, he said, and the attempt at humor came out rough. The voice huffed a short laugh that sounded like someone remembering how to breathe. Copy that, Vaelbright, it said. Stand by, diversion in progress. Hold position if you can. Repeat, hold position if you can. Rowan opened his eyes and stared at the comm panel as if it were a hearth flame. A diversion, fleet ships turning, human engines burning toward them. The thought was almost too much. He keyed the comm once more, and this time his voice shook despite his best effort. We have injured aboard, he said. We have, he hesitated. We have one coalition prisoner, Vael, Keth. He assisted, request instructions. There was a pause, and Rowan imagined the debrief officers on the other end blinking at that line, trying to reconcile doctrine with reality. The voice returned, more cautious now. Copy prisoner, it said. Maintain custody. We will handle upon retrieval. Stand by, Commander. Rescue assets inbound. Stand by. The phrase was simple, mundane. It meant you were not alone. It meant you were being seen. Rowan leaned back in the captain's chair, breathing hard. He felt a pressure behind his eyes, threatening tears, and he hated it because commanders did not cry on bridges. But this was not a normal bridge, and he was not a normal commander anymore. He keyed the medbay comm. Sable, he said, voice hoarse. Fleet answered. For a moment there was only static. Then Sable's voice came in, soft and fierce. Good, she whispered, and Rowan could hear the smile in her pain. Good, now don't you dare die before they get here. Rowan almost laughed. Wasn't planning to, he murmured. Behind him the bridge hatch hissed, and Vael returned, shoulders slightly hunched as if he had crawled through a narrow throat. His throat lines pulsed faintly with exertion. Bypass engaged, Vael said. Aux reactor has more breath, not much, but more. Rowan looked at him, and for a moment he did not know how to speak. Gratitude felt like a dangerous word between enemies. Instead he nodded once, sharp. Good, he said. We flared. Vael's eyes narrowed. I heard, he said simply, and then he stepped to the viewport and stared into the corridor haze as if expecting claws to emerge. They did. The corridor responded to the flare the way hungry things respond to scent. At first, it was just sensor anomalies, movement in the particulate haze, faint emissions flickering at the edge of range. Then the signatures resolved into shapes, scavenger craft, patched and mismatched, converging from multiple vectors like wolves scenting blood. Some were ships Rowan recognized from earlier attacks. Some were new, larger, carrying heavier weapons. They came quickly, drawn by the broadcast's bright identity burst, confident that whatever had lit that flare must be desperate. And there was something else, clean and disciplined, sliding along the corridor edge. A coalition straggler, likely a frigate or light cruiser separated from its group, drawn in by the same scent for different reasons. It moved with wary precision, its scan patterns careful, as if it too had learned fear of the Verge. It did not rush like scavengers. It approached like a hand reaching for a prize. Rowan watched the sensor overlay fill with converging hostiles and felt his stomach sink. The fleet had answered yes, but rescue assets were still inbound. Minutes, maybe longer depending on corridor geometry and warp drift. The Vael could not fight prolonged. Her point defense grid was strained. Her engines sputtered. Her Ox reactor was gasping. She was a wounded giant surrounded by smaller predators, and now she had screamed into the dark. Sable, Rowan said into the comm, keeping his voice steady. We've got company. Sable's reply came immediate, wry despite pain. Of course you do, she said. The universe can't let you have one clean thing. Rowan looked at Vael. Diaz, he asked. Vael's throat lines pulsed faintly, and his gaze remained on the sensor overlay. The flare marks you, he said. Not only to ships, to the wound. Rowan felt that cold prickle again, so it's listening closer. It has always listened, Vael said, and the quiet certainty in his voice made Rowan's skin crawl. But now you have shouted. Rowan's jaw tightened. We need to survive until the fleet arrives, he said. We need to hold them off without burning our systems out. Vael's eyes flicked toward him. You cannot hold them off, he said simply. Not by fighting. Rowan's mouth twisted into a grim smile. Then we cheat, he said, and the words tasted like a vow. Vael's throat lines brightened faintly, not amusement this time, but something like reluctant acknowledgement. The wound scent, Vael said. It clings, it distorts, it pulls. You have residue on your hull from the deep transit. Rowan remembered Vael's earlier phrase, wound writes on you, and felt something shift in his mind like a lock clicking. You mean we can use it, Rowan said, slow. Vael hesitated, and in that hesitation Rowan saw fear. The wound is not a tool, Vael said quietly. Tools obey, this does not. But it reacts, Rowan pressed. It reacted to the cruiser. It consumed their ships. It responded, Vael corrected, voice taut. Like an animal responds, you do not use an animal, you provoke it and hope it bites the other creature. Rowan stared at the sensor overlay. Scavenger craft closing. Coalition straggler creeping. The time until fleet arrival unknown. He felt his shoulder pulse with pain, felt his fatigue like gravity. He thought of Sable's crushed legs and her mandate. He thought of the missing crew, no closure, no bodies, only absence. He thought of the wound's words, return is not free. All right, Rowan said, voice low. We provoke it. Sable's voice crackled over comm. Rowan, she said sharply, what are you thinking? Rowan didn't answer immediately, because explaining madness made it seem more real. Then he forced himself to speak. We still have residue from the fold, he said. Vael says it leaves a scent, we're going to twitch it. Sable's breath hissed through comm. That is the dumbest sentence I've ever heard, she said, and Rowan could hear her fear under the sarcasm. How? Vael stepped closer to the nav display and pointed at a region along the corridor where the haze thickened into faint shimmer, an edge not deep verge, but enough that physics wavered. Here, Vael said, a shallow scar. If you bleed your residue across it, if you pulse your engines and then cut them, pulse and cut like a heartbeat, you may trigger a ripple. The wound may twitch. Rowan looked at the suggested region. It was close enough that they could reach it with minimal thrust, but doing so would bring them nearer to the very thing that had eaten the crew. His stomach tightened. You're proposing we dance on a cliff edge again, Rowan said. Vael's eyes met his. Yes, Vael said. Your species seems fond of cliffs. Rowan's mouth twisted. We're not fond, he muttered. We just keep running out of flat ground. He began the maneuver. He set the Vael on a shallow trajectory toward the shimmer edge, keeping thrust minimal. Then he pulsed the engines, brief, controlled bursts that flared their emissions just enough to smear their warp residue across the corridor's skin. Each pulse made the ship shudder. Each cut left them drifting, breath held. The Ox reactor whined, offended by the demand, but held. On sensors, the scavenger craft surged eagerly toward the new motion, drawn in. The coalition straggler adjusted course too, cautious but persistent, like a hawk circling. Rowan watched their closing vectors and felt sweat bead on his skin. The calm static thickened slightly, the whisper beneath it stirring as if something had noticed the rhythm. Rowan pulsed again, then cut. The ship drifted. The shimmer edge ahead seemed to ripple, faintly, like skin reacting to touch. Again, Vael said softly, and his throat lines pulsed in time with the engine bursts as if his body wanted to synchronize. Rowan pulsed a third time. Then, instead of a clean cut, he let the engines burn half a second longer, enough to drag their residue across the shimmer like a dirty cloth. Then he cut hard. The corridor twitched. It was not dramatic at first. A faint distortion passed through the haze, visible on the viewport as a ripple in starlight. The sensor overlay stuttered. The ghost wakes flared bright and then smeared into new shapes, confusing and sudden. The scavenger craft, less disciplined, began to wobble as their nav systems tried to compensate. One of them overcorrected, drifting too close to a tumbling debris slab. Another ship's missiles, launched in eagerness, curved oddly, their trajectories bending as if pulled by an unseen hand. Rowan felt his stomach drop. The wound was responding, not speaking, not swallowing, but reacting like a muscle twitching. "Hold steady," Rowan muttered, though he did not trust the words. The shimmer edge rippled again, stronger. The calm static surged, and for a heartbeat Rowan heard, clear, intimate, the phrase stamped into his mind again, not shouted this time, but whispered with cold certainty, "Return is not free." Then, beneath it, another pattern, not fully formed words but a suggestion, a new shape pressing against comprehension like a hand against frosted glass. "Something owes." Rowan's breath caught. He forced his attention back to the sensor overlay. The scavengers were panicking now. Their formation broke. Two craft collided, not violently enough to explode, but enough to spin them into helpless tumbles. One ship, trying to correct, fired thrusters too hard and ended up drifting into the shimmer edge. Its signature spiked, then stretched, then flickered. The ship did not vanish entirely, but it warped, as if its hull had become briefly soft. It spun away trailing odd energy, and its pilot's frantic calm chatter filled the band like a wounded animal's cries. The coalition straggler slowed, its disciplined approach halted by sudden caution. Its scan pattern widened, then narrowed, uncertain. It backed off slightly, like a predator that had stepped too close to a trap. Rowan pulsed the engines again, and the ripple event strengthened, spreading across the corridor like a shiver. It was as if the wound had twitched in irritation at being poked, and now the entire lane trembled with its displeasure. Scavenger ships, unprepared for physics that argued, began to scatter. Some fled outright, turning away from the shimmer with desperate thrust. Others hesitated, hungry but afraid. The corridor, for a brief moment, became a place where hunger met terror, and terror had teeth. "This is madness," Sable whispered over calm, and Rowan could hear awe in her fear. "Rowan, I'm buying time," Rowan said through clenched teeth, and he could feel the ship strain like a living thing under his hands. "Just a few minutes." Vael's throat lines pulsed faintly, and Rowan sensed the alien's fear deeper now, not of the scavengers, not of the coalition ship, but of the fact that the wound had responded. Vael stared at the shimmer edge like a man watching a sleeping god stir. "It notices," Vael said, voice tight. Rowan's jaw clenched. "Let it," he muttered. "Let it look at them instead of us." The ripple began to fade, not because Rowan willed it, but because the wound's attention drifted, satisfied, or simply bored. The shimmer edge settled back into faint distortion. The ghost wakes continued to swirl in confused patterns, lingering evidence of the twitch. The scavengers had scattered enough that they were no longer a unified threat, and the coalition straggler held distance, its disciplined caution winning over pursuit. Rowan exhaled slowly, hands trembling. His shoulder burned. The aux reactor warning climbed again, red and furious. He had bought time, but time was expensive. Then the fleet arrived. It began as a faint signature on sensors, so clean and familiar that Rowan's throat tightened. Terran corvettes, fast and sharp, slamming into the corridor like knives thrown with purpose. Their drive emissions flared bright, not trying to hide, because rescue ships in war did not creep. They arrived loud and dared the enemy to object. Their comm signals filled the band with crisp Terran modulation, voices barking orders, target locks snapping into place. To Rowan it sounded like the hearth, not warmth, but noise, the living proof that other humans existed. The first corvette silhouette appeared on the viewport, sleek and predatory, its hull painted with fleet markings that made Rowan's chest ache. It angled between the Vaelbright and the nearest scavenger craft without hesitation. Point defense turrets spat, missiles streaked, and the scavenger ship that had been circling too close detonated in a blossom of flame. Another corvette swung wide, cutting off the coalition stragglers' retreat path and broadcast a single cold warning in Terran Standard. Coalition vessel, disengage or be destroyed. The coalition ship hesitated, scanned the new arrivals, then turned away, choosing survival over pride. It fled into haze, engines burning, and Terran missiles chased it just far enough to make the lesson sharp. Scavengers tried to scatter, but the corvettes were faster. The corridor filled with brief, violent bursts, kinetic fire, plasma flashes, the hard, clean geometry of professional combat. The scavengers, who had believed themselves wolves, found themselves treated like vermin by predators that did not negotiate. A third corvette slid alongside the Vaelbright, matching her wounded drift with careful precision. Rowan's comm panel crackled with a voice that sounded almost like laughter in disbelief. "Vaelbright, this is TCS Mothwing," the pilot said. "By every star that ever burned, you ugly bastard, you're real." Rowan swallowed hard, and for a moment he could not speak. He forced his voice steady. "We're real," he said. "Barely." "Copy barely," the pilot replied, voice tight with emotion she was pretending not to have. "Tow lines coming. Sit still and try not to die in the next 30 seconds. Rowan almost laughed. "We'll do our best." Magnetic tow clamps locked onto the Vaelbright's hull with heavy thuds that traveled through the ship's bones like handshakes. The corvette's engines flared, and the Vaelbright wounded giant felt, for the first time in days, the pull of another ship's strength. It was not gentle. It was not comforting in a soft way. It was a firm grip around the wrist of a drowning man. On the bridge, Rowan's knees nearly buckled with relief, and he caught himself on the console, breathing hard. His vision blurred, his shoulder throbbed. He felt suddenly, violently tired. Sable's voice came over calm, raw, and triumphant. "You did it," she whispered. Rowan swallowed, throat tight. "We did," he said, and he meant it, even with the bitterness and blood in the words. Med teams boarded quickly, their boots loud on the deck, their faces set in focused shock. They moved through the ship with practiced speed, scanning, securing, sealing, their presence filling corridors that had been empty too long. Rowan watched them from the bridge as they checked the consoles, checked him, checked Vael with wary glances. One medic's eyes widened when she saw the broken captain's chair, the frost scars on the panels, the emergency lighting still half failing. "God," she murmured under her breath, and then she was professional again, snapping a scanner over Rowan's shoulder. "This burn's infected," the medic said sharply. "You've been riding fever." Rowan tried to protest, but the medic's look silenced him the way Sable's had. He let them strap his arm more securely, inject painkillers that made the world soften at the edges, and guide him toward the corridor while another team rushed past toward medbay. They evacuated Sable with a care that felt like reverence. Rowan watched from the hallway as they lifted her onto a grav stretcher, her face pale, eyes fierce even through sedation. She caught Rowan's gaze and managed a small, crooked smile. "Don't let them tell my story wrong," she whispered, and then the stretcher carried her away into the brighter, louder world of the fleet's med bay. Rowan's chest ached with something that was not his injuries. He turned away before the emotion could become collapse. They moved him onto the Corvette, into a med compartment that smelled of antiseptic and human breath and the faint metallic tang of recycled air that suddenly seemed luxurious. A fleet medic stabilized his shoulder properly, cleaned the burn with better tools, shook their head at the state of it, and muttered something about stubborn commanders. Rowan let it happen, drifting in and out of a heavy half-sleep. When he woke fully, it was to the sound of voices in a debrief room and the hum of fleet engines around them, the steady presence of other ships like a wall of fire. He sat up slowly, pain flaring, but dulled now by medicine, and found himself in a small compartment with a single viewport. Beyond it, the fleet formation moved, corvettes and frigates and larger ships sliding through the corridor with disciplined purpose. The war was still raging somewhere beyond, but here, in this pocket, there was a sense of order that did not feel like a cage. It felt like a hearth, dangerous, alive, a gathering of heat. A debrief officer arrived, a woman with tired eyes and a voice that had said too many hard things in too many rooms. She asked him for the story. She asked him for timelines. She asked him for the coordinates of the relay buoy. She asked him for the name of the Keth prisoner and why he had assisted. She asked him about the crew. Rowan answered what he could with clinical clarity because clarity was a way not to drown. When she asked about the crew, where were the bodies, where were the suits, what evidence of loss, Rowan felt his throat tighten and the words came slower. "There were no bodies," he said. No depressurization pattern, no blood, they were gone, the ship swallowed them. The officer's pen paused, her eyes flicked up. Swallowed, she repeated. Rowan's jaw clenched. Don't write it like a myth, he said sharply. Don't make it a legend. People vanished. I don't get to bury them. I don't get to tell their families what happened. I have an empty ship and a closet full of gloves and photographs. That's what I have. The officer's expression softened just a fraction, but her voice remained careful. Understood, she said. We will classify it as anomalous loss pending investigation. Rowan gave a bitter laugh. Pending, he muttered. Everything's pending. They treated him later like a story, not in cruelty, but in the way humans clung to symbols in war. Sailors shook his hand with a kind of reverence they did not know how to hide. Someone in the corridor called the Vael the ghost ship, under their breath. A young ensign stared at Rowan as if expecting him to glow. Rowan hated it, not because he disliked respect, but because respect was too clean. It polished the blood off, turned the torn edges into smooth narrative. It made the crew's absence into a dramatic detail rather than an open wound. When he could, he returned to the Vael, now towed and cradled in formation like a wounded animal among its herd. The ship felt different with other humans moving through her corridors, voices echoing, lights brighter. But the emptiness remained. You could not fill a missing crew with borrowed footsteps. Rowan walked the central spine and paused at the maintenance closet shrine. The door had been left closed, but he could feel the presence of it behind the metal, like a held breath. He did not open it. He did not want strangers to see what he had collected. Some grief was private. Some grief was a duty. Vael was taken into custody with firm professionalism rather than brutality. Fleet security arrived with restraints designed for Keth anatomy, and Vael offered his wrists without resistance. His throat lines pulsed faintly, steady, but Rowan could see tension in the set of his shoulders. Vael was not afraid of imprisonment as such. He had been a prisoner already. He was afraid, Rowan suspected, of returning to his doctrine after what he had seen. Fear of being believed. Fear of not being believed. Fear of the wound's voice following him back like a scent. Rowan intercepted the security team outside a small holding compartment and stood facing Vael for a moment while the guards waited. The corridor around them hummed with fleet life, voices, boots, the distant clang of repair crews, but between Rowan and Vael there was the quiet tension of something that could not be easily named. Vael's black eyes met Rowan's. You have returned to your hearth, Vael said softly. Rowan swallowed. He could still feel the wound's presence like a bruise behind his eyes. We did, he said. Vael's throat lines pulsed faintly. You will present me to your commanders, Vael said. It was not accusation, just statement. Rowan nodded. I will, he replied, but not as a trophy. Vael's gaze narrowed slightly. What am I then? Rowan hesitated. Words mattered. Words made things real. A witness, Rowan said finally. To what happened, to what you did. Vael's throat lines dimmed, and for a moment he looked away, as if the corridor's metal wall was safer to stare at than Rowan's face. I did what preserved my life, Vael said, but the words lacked conviction. Rowan leaned closer, voice low so the guards could not hear every syllable. You lifted the strut, Rowan said. You crawled into Deck 7 junction to keep our reactor breathing. You told me how to twitch the scar. Call it whatever you want, but you chose. Vael's eyes returned to Rowan's. In them, Rowan saw something altered, still cold, still disciplined, but with a hairline fracture running through the certainty. Your engineer, Vael said quietly, would have died, and you would have died trying to save her. Rowan nodded once, sharp. Yes. Vael's throat lines pulsed faintly. You bind yourselves with promises, Vael murmured, echoing his earlier observation. It is a weakness. It makes you predictable. It makes you suffer. Rowan's mouth twisted. And it makes us show up, he said. It makes us come back for each other. It makes us refuse to be erased clean. Vael held his gaze for a long moment. Then he inclined his head in that precise Keth gesture that was neither bow nor salute but something between. I respect that, Vael said, and the words sounded like admitting pain. Rowan exhaled slowly. He felt the war in his bones, the exhaustion, the bitterness. He also felt something like gratitude, sharp and unwelcome and real. You kept her alive, Rowan said. You kept us alive, I won't forget. Vael's throat lines brightened faintly, a flicker that might have been surprise. Do not mistake memory for mercy, Vael said, but his voice was softer than the words. Rowan's smile was thin. I don't, he said. The guards tightened Vael's restraints, and Vael stepped into custody with controlled grace. As he walked away, he did not look back, but Rowan felt the alien's presence linger like a shadow that had learned the shape of human corridors. The fleet moved on. War did not pause for rescues. There were orders to follow, corridors to burn, enemies to outrun. The Vaelbright was towed, patched enough to remain intact, her engines quiet, her guns still wounded. Rowan remained under medical supervision, his shoulder stabilized, infection treated, pain dulled. Sable underwent surgery, the best the fleet could provide in transit, and the prognosis became a hard word spoken gently. Permanent damage, uncertain walking, long rehabilitation. When Rowan visited her in the fleet med bay, she greeted him with a glare and said, "If I wake up with a metal pin to my pillow, I'm throwing it at you." Rowan had laughed then, a rough sound that surprised him, and said, "Deal." He tried to sleep, but sleep in the aftermath did not come clean. When he closed his eyes, he saw the bridge empty, heard Captain Merrick's voice, heard the wound's verdict. He would wake with the taste of copper in his mouth and the sense that someone had been standing just outside his viewport. The fleet medics called it stress. The psychologists called it trauma. Rowan called it listening. It was during one of these restless nights that the mark appeared. Rowan sat in a small compartment aboard the Corvette that had taken him in, his shoulder aching dully, his mind refusing rest. He had pulled up the Vaelbright's archived logs on a secured terminal, reviewing data for the debrief, trying to make sense of the timestamps that overlapped, the sensor returns that contradicted. He scrolled through the comm recordings from the Deep Verge transit, the one where the wound had spoken. He told himself it was for procedure. He told himself it was for evidence. The truth was simpler and darker. He wanted to know he had not imagined it. He wanted to prove the universe had spoken, because proving meant you could perhaps respond. The comm file played. Static, thick, voices faint. Then the phrase, stamped into audio in a way that made Rowan's skin crawl, "Return is not free." The waveform itself spiked in unnatural symmetry, like a pattern deliberately imposed. Rowan paused the playback and stared at the waveform. Something about it tugged at his eye, not like language but like code. He zoomed in, isolating the spike patterns, and saw repetition that was too consistent for random interference. A sequence. A structure. He pulled the sensor residue logs from the moment of the fold's twitch, the ripple event they had provoked near the shimmer edge. The data was messy, full of ghost wakes and distorted trajectories, but embedded in the noise was a repeating coordinate cluster, appearing and reappearing across different sensor bands as if the same point had been marked in multiple ways. At first, Rowan assumed it was an artifact of the buoy map overlay, a glitch. Then he realized the coordinates did not match any known corridor point in the fleet's charts. They were offset, deeper into the Halo Verge, in a region marked in older archives with warnings and blank spaces. His stomach tightened. He checked again, cross-referencing. The coordinates persisted. Then he saw something else. In the log entry he had recorded after the deep transit, his own words, his own handwriting transcribed into text, there was a line he did not remember writing. It sat between sentences like a splinter. The font matched. The timestamp matched. But the language was wrong, not Terran Standard, not Keth. It was a string of symbols that resembled the foreign alphabet patterns the ship systems had displayed in error states. Rowan stared at it until his eyes ached. He copied the symbols into a separate window and ran a simple pattern analysis, the kind used for corrupted data recovery. The symbols rearranged themselves under the algorithm's attempt to find structure, not translating into words but into a repeating shape, a loop, then a break, then a loop again. It looked like a door opening and closing. The comm file, still paused, flickered. For a heartbeat, Rowan heard the whisper beneath static rise again, not through speakers but inside his head, as intimate as breath. "Return is not free," it pressed. Then, softer, almost curious, "Come back." Rowan's hands went cold. He looked up sharply as if expecting to see someone in the compartment. There was only dim light, the hum of fleet engines, the soft murmur of distant voices through bulkheads. Safe. Warm in the way steel could be warm. The hearth. But the coordinates glowed on the terminal screen like a brand. He saved them. Not in the official debrief file. That would invite immediate classification, skepticism, the smoothing of edges into bureaucracy, but in a private log, encrypted under an old exploration protocol key that only he would think to use. He saved the comm waveform spikes. He saved the symbol string. He saved the coordinates again and again, as if repetition could anchor them. When dawn cycle came, if dawn meant anything aboard ships running on tactical time, Rowan brought the file to Sable. He sat by her med bed while she drank bitter nutrient broth and glared at the ceiling like it had offended her personally. He showed her the coordinates on a small handheld display. Sable squinted, then swore softly. That's deep, she said. Rowan nodded. It's not on our charts, he said, but it's in our logs. It keeps appearing. Sable's jaw tightened. The wound left you a breadcrumb, she said. Rowan swallowed. Or a hook, he replied. Sable's eyes flicked to him sharp. You're going to tell command, she said. Rowan hesitated. Not yet, he said. Not until I know what it is. Not until I know whether it's a trap or whether it's the crew, Sable finished, voice low. Rowan's throat tightened. He looked away because the thought hit too close. The crew might not be dead. They might be elsewhere, as Vael had said the fold could unthread things. The wound might have swallowed them and kept them. The wound might have offered coordinates not as gift but as demand. You want closure, you come back. Return is not free. Sable watched him with a fierce, weary understanding. You're not going to let this go, she said. Rowan's mouth twisted. Would you? He asked. Sable's laugh was dry. If I can't walk, I can still crawl, she said, and there was stubborn fire in the words. Then her expression softened in a way that made Rowan's chest ache. But not now, she added. Now we heal, now we survive. Then, she flicked her fingers at the display at the coordinates. Then we decide how much we're willing to pay. Rowan nodded slowly, and he felt the weight of it settle into place. Not a clean ending, not victory with banners, but a hearth reached with smoke in lungs and blood on hands and an open wound in the story. The fleet moved on, engines burning, formation tight. The war remained ahead like a storm that did not care about their individual suffering. In the viewport, far off at the edge of sensor range, the Halo Verge hung like a bruise on the horizon, a dark lacework of wrong angles faintly visible when the stars aligned just so. Rowan stood in the corridor outside the med bay one evening and stared at it, feeling the fleet's hum under his boots, feeling the warmth of other humans nearby. Voices, laughter, curses, the ordinary sacred noise of living people. Home was real. The hearth existed. He could almost believe, if he narrowed his mind to the immediate, that survival was enough, but the bruise on the horizon seemed to watch back. Rowan pressed his palm against the cold viewport glass and felt, absurdly, the echo of Vael's gesture, listening to ship, listening to scar. The whisper beneath static did not rise into words now. It did not need to. The coordinates sat in his pocket like a small hot stone. The phrase return is not free-lived in his bones like a second heartbeat. And somewhere in the wound, something that had tasted their stubbornness had left a mark and a summons. Rowan did not pray. He did not bargain aloud. He simply stood there, a battered commander with a bandaged shoulder and a mind scarred by voices, and watched the fleet's lights move like fireflies in the dark. He knew the war would demand more of them. He knew the healers would demand patience. He knew Sable would demand honesty. He knew Vael, in custody, would carry his own fracture back into coalition doctrine like a splinter. And he knew, with a clarity that felt both dreadful and strangely steady, that the Halo Verge was no longer just a place they had survived. It was part of their story now, and stories, like wounds, did not end just because you reached the hearth.